They called it a mercy, the marriage. London's drawing rooms whispered it over teacups with the practiced tenderness of people who enjoyed cruelty wrapped in silk. Poor Vivienne Ashcroft, barren, broken, past saving. And the Duke? Dying. A perfect match. Two ruined lives tidied into one quiet grave. But here's what the drawing rooms never understood about desperate people. They stopped performing for audiences. They stopped fearing the verdict. And when a woman who has lost everything finally stands inside a room with a man who has nothing left to protect, something far more dangerous than scandal begins. Stay close, because this story does not end the way London planned. The morning of the announcement, Vivienne did not cry. She had expected to. She had spent the 3 days following her mother's declaration sitting with the anticipation of grief the way one sits beside a fire that hasn't caught yet, waiting, feeding it small materials, certain the collapse was coming. It did not come. What arrived instead, as Hartwell Ashcroft's butler laid out her breakfast on the third morning, and her mother descended the staircase with the composed expression of a woman who had already completed her morning and moved neatly into administration, was something closer to the recognition of a long-held suspicion finally proven true. She had never been safe here. "You'll receive him Thursday," her mother, Constance Ashcroft, said, settling into the chair across from her with the efficiency of a woman conducting inventory. Not meet him. Receive him. As if Vivienne were a parcel to be transferred, and the Duke was simply the new address. "I haven't agreed," Vivienne said. Constance lifted the silver coffee pot with the unhurried certainty of someone who had already won an argument that the other party did not yet know had occurred. "You agreed the moment Dr. Harwick's report reached the Ashcroft solicitors. You agreed when your name stopped appearing on invitation lists. You agreed, my darling, when Lady Pemberton returned your calling card last Tuesday without explanation." Vivienne set down her fork. The truth of it wasn't in the words. It was in the architecture of the thing, the way her mother had constructed this sentence. Each clause a locked door, each conjunction a corridor leading only forward. She had been living inside this argument for months without knowing it was already decided. "He's dying," Vivienne said. Not a protest. More like naming a thing in a room full of people pretending it wasn't there. "He is ill," Constance corrected. The distinction, in her mother's vocabulary, was apparently meaningful. "Men of his station manage illness with considerably more dignity than your tone implies. He is the Duke of Ravenshire. He has 4 estates, 2 of which are financially solvent by any honest accounting. He has a London house in Grosvenor Square that has not been sold despite the rumors about his finances, which tells you something about the quality of the rumors. It could tell me he simply hasn't found a buyer. It could, but it doesn't." Constance looked at her then, the full look, the one that had always felt less like being seen and more like being assessed for remaining utility. "You are 27, Vivienne. Your name has been attached to that lie about Dr. Fenwick's examination for over a year. It does not matter that it is a lie. What matters is that it has traveled further than the truth ever will. You are not going to receive a better offer." The cruelest thing about her mother was not her coldness. It was her accuracy. Vivienne looked out the window at the Mayfair street where a footman was attempting to calm 2 horses that had spooked at something invisible. Both animals' eyes showing white, their bodies locked in a panic response to a threat no one else could verify. She understood this completely. "What is he actually like?" she said. Still not a question. A concession, maybe. The first one. Constance's expression shifted by degrees too small for most people to measure. But Vivienne had spent 27 years learning her mother's face the way coastal navigators learn rocks. That particular shift meant, "I don't entirely know, and I am choosing not to admit that." "He is private," Constance said finally. "He was considered quite brilliant before the illness. His people are loyal, which is always the mark of something. He does not appear at social events, which has fed the stories. He is 34. She paused. "He is not what you're imagining." "What am I imagining?" "Something Gothic." Constance's mouth moved in what was almost a smile. "A man who sits alone in a darkened room reading his own obituary. You always had a novelist's tendency toward dramatics, Vivienne. He is simply a man in difficult circumstances who requires a practical arrangement." As do I, Vivienne said. Exactly. The word landed between them like a coin on marble. Her mother lifted her coffee. The negotiation was complete. She wore gray to the Thursday meeting. Not the soft dove gray that signaled romantic resignation, but a harder shade, closer to the color of winter roads, a deliberate choice that announced she understood the occasion's actual nature and refused to dress it as something else. Her maid Elspeth had suggested the blue silk twice without success, and had ultimately pinned Vivienne's hair with the resigned efficiency of someone who had long since stopped attempting to win. Nathaniel Ravenshire arrived with two of his people and without warning at 11:15, a full quarter hour before the agreed time. Vivienne was in the front parlor when she heard the door, still reviewing the terms her mother's solicitor had outlined that morning, terms she had read 3 times and found quietly humiliating in the specific way that things designed to look generous while extracting everything always are. She had the document folded in her hands when the butler appeared at the parlor threshold, and behind him, after a beat of hallway sound, the Duke of Ravenshire walked through her mother's door and into whatever remained of her life. She had prepared several impressions, and he confounded all of them immediately. He was tall, this she had been told, but the information had not adequately prepared her for the particular quality of his height, which was not the theatrical sort that announces itself from the threshold, but something more functional, as if the room simply reconfigured around him without anyone deciding to allow it. He was lean in the way men are lean when they have been ill for some period of time and their bodies have applied a kind of austere editing to themselves. But there was nothing diminished about the way he stood. He had dark hair going slightly unmanaged at the ends, dark eyes, a face that had been, at some earlier point, considered handsome and had since become something more interesting. A face that had recorded argument, loss, and sustained frustration in its lines, and was not attempting to soften any of that for the current audience. He looked at her directly. Most men, upon entering these arrangements, look somewhere adjacent to a woman. At the portrait behind her, at the window, at the floor, as if eye contact would constitute some premature intimacy they weren't prepared to commit to. Nathaniel Ravenshire looked at her with the steady, analytical attention of someone who had decided information was more useful than performance. She looked back. "Miss Ashcroft." His voice was lower than she'd anticipated, and without the social patina, that particular upper-class English veneer that turned every statement into a kind of auditory upholstery. It was simply a voice, direct, a little worn, as if he'd spent the last year talking less than was socially required and had stopped compensating for it. "Your Grace," she said. She did not stand up immediately, a choice that was either collected or rude depending on who was evaluating it, and she was past the point of managing that distinction. He sat, not waiting to be offered the seat, which told her something. His man, younger, watchful, with the kind of face that absorbed information without broadcasting conclusions, remained near the door. Constance Ashcroft had calculated her entrance for exactly 4 minutes after the Duke's arrival, which meant Vivienne and Nathaniel Ravenshire currently had 4 minutes alone in a room together, the first conversation of what was, apparently, to be the rest of their lives. He glanced at the document still folded in her hands. "The terms," he said. "Yes." "Did you find them satisfactory?" The question was asked with a frankness that briefly disarmed her, because it was not the question people asked in these situations. The expected question was whether she had reviewed them, or whether she had any questions about the specific language, diplomatic scaffolding designed to avoid the actual subject of whether both parties were walking into this with open eyes or closed ones. "No," she said. Something moved across his face. Not offense, more like recognition. The quality of a man hearing a response he had already drafted and was now confirming the accuracy of. "Which part?" he said. "The clause that specifies I require your countersignature on any correspondence to my own solicitor regarding my personal funds." She held his gaze. "I understand the practical purpose it serves under the marriage settlement. I simply think you should know that I found it objectionable." "You'd be right to," he said. She waited. "That clause is from my solicitor, not from me. He includes it in every arrangement of this structure. I have no interest in controlling your correspondence." He paused. I have enough difficulty managing my own. The last sentence was quieter, and she understood it was not meant as a social remark. It had escaped him slightly, the honesty of it, in the way that statements about one's actual circumstances sometimes surface without invitation when a person is simply too tired to maintain the architecture of pretense. Are you actually dying? She asked. The Duke of Ravenshire looked at her for a long moment. That's the most honest question anyone has asked me since the diagnosis. That isn't an answer. No. He was quiet for a moment. I have been ill for 14 months. I have been told 3 different things by 3 different doctors. 2 of those doctors were retained by members of my extended family, which I have recently come to find significant. His jaw tightened briefly. Whether I am dying depends, I suspect, on which version of events is accurate. I am currently inclined to believe it is neither of the versions provided by my relatives. Something shifted in the room. Not the atmosphere exactly, but the coordinates of it. The way the conversation had started at a formal distance and arrived somewhere else entirely, a place neither of them had planned for. They told me you were Barren, he said. His tone was not unkind, but it was unsparing. I want you to know that I'm aware that the timing and delivery of that particular report was unusual. Vivienne's hand stayed still on the document. She had trained them to do this over the past year. Stay still, register nothing, because the alternative was to broadcast, and she could not afford to broadcast. Why are you telling me that? She said. Because I think we may be in a similar position, he said, and because I believe it's useful to begin with the truth when the truth is available. Constance Ashcroft arrived at that precise moment, entering with the composed authority of a woman who had never been late for anything intentional in her life, and the conversation calcified back into the formal register of terms and introductions and the particular social choreography of 2 families negotiating a merger dressed as a marriage. But Vivienne sat with what he had said for the rest of that meeting and into the days that followed, turning it over the way one turns over a stone to see what lived underneath. We may be in a similar position, not comfort, not flattery, just the cold, exact language of someone who had decided that accurate maps were more valuable than pretty ones. What? The wedding took place on a Tuesday in October, attended by fewer people than the Ashcroft family's social position would normally have warranted, which was a testament to the efficiency with which Vivienne's reputation had been dismantled. The ceremony was in a small church in Kensington that Constance Ashcroft had selected for its discretion rather than its grandeur, a choice that managed to announce the family's embarrassment while simultaneously disguising itself as taste. Vivienne's dress was simple and well cut, and cost more than the Ashcroft household could comfortably afford. She wore it because her mother had insisted, and because she understood that some performances are the price of a certain kind of survival. She looked at Nathaniel's profile during the vows, and found him looking at his own hands, not at the floor, not at the window, at his hands, at the way they held still, at the particular conscious stillness of a man who has trained himself not to show what his body wants to do when it's under pressure. She recognized this too. She had spent a year developing the same skill. When the ceremony ended, his man, she would learn his name was Callum, and that he had been with the Duke for 6 years and would walk through walls for him, brought the carriage around with a speed that suggested someone had been counting minutes. The drive to Ravenshire House in Grosvenor Square was conducted largely in silence, punctuated by the London street sounds coming through the carriage window, and the specific quality of quiet that exists between 2 people who have not yet established what their particular silence is allowed to contain. You should sleep, Nathaniel said, without looking at her. The drive to Alderley tomorrow will take most of the day. Alderley? The estate, in Shropshire. He glanced at her. We won't remain in London. I find it inadvisable at present. Because of the illness, among other things. He looked back at the window. The city moved past in its unreliable November colors, gray buildings, the yellow of lamp-lit windows beginning to appear as the afternoon thinned. London has too many people with an active interest in my health. She thought again about what he had said in the parlor. The 2 of his doctors had been retained by relatives. She thought about the way he had said significant, that measured word choosing to carry more weight than it was showing. Your family, she said. My cousin Gerald, he said. The name was flat, stripped of any performance of feeling. And his mother, my aunt Henrietta. They have managed between them to communicate to most of London's medical community that my prognosis is settled. They have also, in the past 18 months, positioned themselves to benefit substantially from my estate in the event of my death. His voice did not change in the way most voices change when a person speaks about their own potential death. There was no dip, no speeding, just the same measured delivery. I have spent a considerable amount of energy recently trying to establish whether they are simply optimistic or whether they have been assisting the condition they're predicting. The carriage went over a cobblestone seam and the lamps swayed. Vivienne looked at the side of his face, at the set of his jaw in the moving light. And now you've married, she said. Now I've married. He turned and looked at her directly. That same quality of attention she had noticed in the parlor, unperformed, unpadded, which complicates their calculations somewhat. A wife introduces a competing interest in the estate. It muddies the succession. Gerald particularly dislikes uncertainty. I see. She held his gaze. So I am a complication. You are a deliberate one, he said. Not cruelly. The way you acknowledge that a strategy exists without apologizing for having a strategy. She should have been offended. She had been prepared for the transactional nature of this arrangement, had rehearsed her own emotional architecture around it for weeks. But there was something in the plainness of the statement, its refusal to dress itself as something noble, that was actually easier to receive than kindness would have been. She was a strategic complication. He was a man trying to survive people who wanted him to die. They were both beginning from an honest place. What exactly, she said, do you expect from me? It was quiet for a moment. Outside, someone called out to a passing cart, the London noise. Patience, he said, an ability to observe without broadcasting, and the willingness, if it comes to it, to act quickly on incomplete information. He paused. I don't expect you to find this satisfactory. No, she said, but I find it clear. I can work with clear, he said. Alderley Edge arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in the specific early winter light that does to English countryside what nothing else does. Strips everything to its structure, to the bare decision of the land, the trees holding only their shapes, the hedgerows drawn in charcoal against pale sky. The estate itself came into view at the top of a long approach road, and Vivienne saw it through the carriage window with the particular attention she had trained herself to apply to new environments, a threat inventory disguised as appreciation. It was larger than she had expected. The house was stone, Jacobean in origin, but extended and adjusted by multiple generations into something that expressed not a single aesthetic vision, but the accumulated decisions of people who had each added a wing or a wing's worth of conviction to the original structure. It should have been discordant. Instead, it had the coherence of things that have simply endured. An argument resolved not by any one party winning, but by time wearing all the positions down to something livable. The staff had assembled in the front courtyard, 12 of them, standing with the particular quality of stillness that servants adopt when they are trying to communicate both welcome and professional neutrality simultaneously. Vivienne scanned faces. She had learned to read servant households quickly, had understood since childhood that the architecture of a house's below-stairs life told you everything about the architecture of its above-stairs one. What she saw here was loyalty without performance. These people were not arranged for the occasion. They were simply there, in the way that people who have been somewhere long enough to stop preparing for inspection stand, present, comfortable, with the small informal human adjustments, a housekeeper's hand briefly resting on a footman's arm, a groom's weight shifted to one hip, that signal they have been themselves in this place long enough to stop managing it. The housekeeper, a compact woman of about 60, with sharp dark eyes, and the expression of someone who had been running this household through considerable difficulty and was going to keep doing so, stepped forward. Your Grace. She nodded to Nathaniel, then turned to Vivienne. Your Grace. The honorific directed at her still had an unfamiliar texture. Vivienne received it without comment. Mrs. Hartley, Nathaniel said, this is the Duchess. He didn't add any modifier or instruction or qualifier. The sentence was complete on its own. Mrs. Hartley looked at Vivienne with eyes that were evaluating without being unkind. "We've prepared the East Wing rooms," she said, "as directed. The sitting room connecting the apartments has been furnished to your graces." A slight pause, assessing. "To our best estimation of what might be comfortable." "Thank you," Vivienne said. "I'll tell you what needs adjusting once I've seen it." Something shifted minutely in Mrs. Hartley's expression. Appreciation, maybe. Or the specific recognition a competent person has upon meeting another competent person. The brief, wordless acknowledgement that efficiency may be possible. Oh. The connecting sitting room was generous, furnished with pieces that had been chosen recently and carefully. Not the discarded inventory of a house making do, but a room that someone had actually thought about. A fireplace, already lit. Bookshelves with books that had been read, their spines carrying the comfortable irregularity of use. A writing desk positioned toward the window, which looked out at a kitchen garden, and beyond it, at the edge of the Shropshire countryside fading into late afternoon. Vivienne stood in the center of it for a moment after Mrs. Hartley had left her there. She did not unpack her sentimentality. She had learned to leave that particular luggage in whatever room she'd last occupied it in, because carrying it into new arrangements was not something she could afford. But she stood in the center of this room that someone had prepared for her with apparent care, and she allowed herself to register it, not as hope, exactly, because hope had been confiscated from her by increments over the past year and a half, and she had not yet assembled enough evidence to reclaim it, but as data, as the beginning of an accurate picture. She was at the window when Nathaniel knocked. He did knock. She would come to understand this was a consistent quality in him, that he did not assume his own welcome anywhere, including in his own house, and came in with a folder of papers under one arm and the look of a man who had been building toward a conversation and decided to have it now rather than observe the social convention of allowing her a settling-in period. "I want to show you something," he said. He set the folder on the writing desk without preamble. "Before dinner, before you've been here long enough to start forming opinions that will be harder to correct later." She came to the desk. The folder held documents. Some were medical, or were framed as medical, reports with official headings and signatures that she recognized as the format of the professional reports that had circulated about her own situation. The parallel was not lost on her, and she did not think it was intended to be. Others were financial. Records of estate transactions conducted during Nathaniel's illness, decisions bearing his signature that he spread on the desk beside the originals and let her observe the comparison, the slight irregularities, the pressure differences, the specific quality of a signature rendered from a copy rather than produced naturally. "Someone forged these," she said. Not a question. On at least 4 occasions. He stood beside her at the desk, close enough that she was aware of the particular warmth a person carries, the specific physical fact of another human being. The transactions benefited Gerald's account directly in 2 cases. In the other 2, they benefited a property company whose full ownership I have not yet been able to establish, but whose managing director is a man who has dined at my Aunt Henrietta's house on at least 6 occasions in the past year. How did you establish that? Callum. Something moved across his face when he said the name. Not softness exactly, but acknowledgement. He has been building this record for 8 months, while I was unable to do it myself. She understood what he was describing. The period of the illness's worst progress. The months when he would have been incapacitated enough that the people around him could act without immediate consequence. And the medical reports, she said. Dr. Harwick, who has examined me on behalf of my aunt twice, and Dr. Fenwick. He paused. At the name Fenwick, his eyes came up to her face with a directness that was almost careful. Vivienne's hands were still on the document in front of her. Dr. Fenwick examined me, she said. Her voice came out level, which cost her something. I know. He was watching her. Fenwick is Gerald's arrangement. He has been providing assessments on at least 2 people in this situation, providing assessments that, whether or not they correspond to actual findings, serve the interest of whoever is paying him. The room was very quiet. Outside, the kitchen garden held its bare winter geometry, the last light going out of the sky above the distant tree line. He told my mother I would never carry a child, Vivienne said. Yes. You're telling me he was paid to say that? I'm telling you I believe it to be possible, Nathaniel said. The precision was careful, deliberate, so he would not state as fact what he could not prove. She was learning this about him. I cannot give you certainty yet, but I have enough to tell you that Fenwick's professional history, when properly assembled, does not describe an honest physician. She looked at the documents, at the forged signatures beside the originals, at the careful compilation of a case that a sick man's loyal retainer had been building in secret for 8 months. She thought about the drawing rooms, about Lady Pemberton's returned calling card, about her mother's face when she had said, "You are not going to receive a better offer," and the way it had contained, under the accuracy, something that might have been apology but had never quite broken the surface. "What do you want me to do?" she said. "I want you to read everything," he said. "I want you to tell me what you see because you will see it differently than Callum or I will. You have a different position in this." He paused. "I also want you to understand that I am not merely using you as a tactical piece in my own argument. What was done to your name matters independently of what was done to my estate." She looked at him. "They are connected," he said. Fenwick's assessment served Gerald's purposes in both cases. Discrediting you helped position the marriage as a transaction that could be dismissed. Two ruined people making a quiet end of things, no complications, no one paying close attention. If we were both beneath notice, no one would look too carefully at the financial movements during my illness. She heard the whole of it. The architecture of the scheme laid plain. Two reputations destroyed simultaneously, each one making the other's destruction easier to manage and harder to dispute. "They used my disgrace," she said, "to make your death look inevitable." "Yes." His voice was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the kitchen garden with a sound like turning pages. "All right," she said. He waited. "Show me everything you have," she said. They sat together at the writing desk for 3 hours. Callum brought more materials at some point, additional financial records, a second set of the medical documentation in a separate folder that he placed on the desk without ceremony and then withdrew. Mrs. Hartley brought tea that neither of them drank while it was hot, and that was eventually removed and replaced with a second tray that met the same fate. The fire burned down twice and was rebuilt by someone who entered and left so quietly they barely registered it. What Vivienne saw, as she worked through the documents with the meticulous attention she had once applied to her own social survival, was a scheme of considerable complexity and considerable patience. Gerald Ravenshire and Henrietta Morrow, Gerald's mother, Nathaniel's aunt, had been maneuvering for at least 3 years before the illness began. The illness itself had either been deliberately induced or had arrived as an opportunity they were prepared to exploit with a speed that suggested preparation. The financial movements were subtle in isolation and obvious in aggregate. The small transactions that individually looked like household management that cumulatively represented a systematic dismantling of the estate's liquid assets in directions that benefited Gerald's portfolio. And threaded through it, tying two apparently separate stories into one structure, were Fenwick's reports. "He charged different rates," Vivienne said, pointing to a payment record in the financial documents. "For the 2 examinations, mine cost less." Nathaniel looked at the figure. "Meaning what?" "Meaning the disgrace of a young woman from a family without significant power costs less than a medical prognosis affecting a dukedom." She looked at the number with a coldness she had earned. "I am a bargain rate casualty." She had not intended this to be humorous, but something in the bluntness of it produced a brief, involuntary response in Nathaniel's face. Not quite a smile, more the ghost of one, the kind that surfaces when a person who has been managing sustained grimness encounters a sentence that exactly names a thing. "You have a very direct relationship with unpleasant information," he said. "I've had practice," she said. "So have I." He looked at the papers. Then, after a moment, "Do you believe Fenwick is the only one?" She had been sitting with this question herself for the last hour, turning it from different angles. "No," she said. "Fenwick is a tool. He does what he's paid to do. But someone arranged for his report about me to reach London society at precisely the moment it would do maximum damage. That's not Fenwick. That requires either Gerald or your aunt, and it requires either a direct connection to my family's social circle or a very efficient intermediary. She paused. Who does your aunt know in Mayfair? Nathaniel was very still for a moment. My aunt, he said, with the quiet of a man walking carefully through a conclusion that is forming as he speaks, is a close acquaintance of Lady Hargreave. Vivienne looked at him. Lady Hargreave was the woman who had told Lady Pemberton, who had been at the Caldwell soiree where the story had first circulated in assembled company rather than whispered corners, who had been, in the distributed economy of Vivienne's destruction, the central exchange through which the damage had been routed. They knew each other, she said, before any of this. For years. His jaw was set with the particular tension of a person assembling a picture they already didn't want to see come fully into focus. I didn't connect it. Hargreave moves in different circles. I wouldn't have placed her near my aunt's particular interests. No, Vivienne said. Neither would anyone else. The fire snapped. The room was full of the specific quality of late-night silence in an old house, the kind that has a texture to it, an accumulated weight. They chose you deliberately, Nathaniel said. The word you arrived with a careful, almost reluctant weight, as if he understood that what he was saying required the other person to receive something difficult. Not simply as a structural piece, as a specific person. Your family's position, respectable enough to lend legitimacy to the arrangement, compromised enough not to ask too many questions. My mother asked no questions, Vivienne said. Her voice was steady. She was relieved. A dying duke is better than an unmarried daughter with a ruined reputation, in my mother's arithmetic. Your mother may not have known. No, Vivienne agreed. She may not have. That would have made her useful. She looked at the stack of documents, at the evidence of a system designed to consume both of them quietly, efficiently, without leaving material for anyone to take to a solicitor or a magistrate or the front page of a newspaper that would print what the drawing rooms wouldn't say aloud. We can break it, she said, not quickly and not without building the case properly. But the structure has a weakness, which is that it relied on us not talking to each other. He looked at her. They assumed, she continued, that you would be too ill and too proud to tell your new wife the actual situation. And they assumed I would be too grateful and too frightened to ask inconvenient questions. They designed the arrangement around what they expected us to be. She held his gaze. They expected two people performing a dignified dying. They got something else. For the first time in the 3 hours they had been sitting together, Nathaniel Ravenshire's face fully opened. Not warmth, exactly, not yet, but the unmistakable quality of a person recognizing that the thing they have been attempting to carry alone may actually be shareable without compromising its integrity. They got something else, he repeated. Yes. She gathered the documents into their appropriate folders with practiced efficiency. Now, you said earlier that you believed your illness may have been assisted. I want to know what you're eating. I want to know who prepares it, who has access to the kitchen, and whether any of those people have a connection to Gerald's household. She looked up, and I want to know if Callum is aware of all the relevant parties in this, because if he isn't, we need to correct that immediately. Nathaniel Ravensshire looked at his wife. Callum, he called, his voice carrying into the corridor without raising it. The door opened within seconds. Callum entered with the attentiveness of someone who had not been far. We need more tea, Nathaniel said. And then you're going to tell the Duchess everything you know about the kitchen staff's employment history. Callum looked at Vivienne. She saw in his face the brief, careful assessment, the same one he had applied to her in the Ashcroft parlor and on the carriage steps, and at every point of transition where he had been present. She held it without blinking. Whatever he concluded, he closed the sitting room door and went to get the tea. She found the letter at midnight. She had not intended to be awake. The 3 hours at the desk and the weeks of exhaustion preceding them should have been sufficient to produce sleep the moment she lay down. But the house was new around her. Its particular acoustics, the different quality of its darkness, the specific character of a strange place's silence, and her body was doing what it had learned to do in the past year and a half, staying alert. She had been going through the final folder, the one Callum had brought in the second delivery, looking for anything she had missed in the initial review. The letter was near the bottom, folded smaller than the documents around it, written not on official paper but on the plain notepaper that suggested private correspondence rather than formal record. It was addressed to Gerald. It was from a Dr. Arthur Pembroke, dated 14 months ago, the month of Nathaniel's first symptoms. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph described a compound. The second paragraph described its administration method and its principal effect on the body's ability to process certain minerals and sustain muscular function over time. The third paragraph contained a sentence that she read twice and then sat very still with for a long moment. The symptoms will progress consistent with natural illness of the degenerative type. No ordinary physician will identify the compound absent specifically directed testing. The subject will decline at a rate that appears natural and will be entirely consistent with the diagnosis we have provided to the family's retained medical counsel. Vivienne held the letter. The fire had burned low. The room was cold in the way that country houses are cold at midnight when the staff is asleep and the heat has retreated to somewhere more insular. She could hear the wind outside and somewhere below the settling of the old house adjusting itself in the dark. She was holding a document that described, in clinical language, the deliberate poisoning of the man sleeping on the other side of the connecting wall. She stood up. She crossed to the connecting door between the sitting room and Nathaniel's apartments, and she knocked 3 times, sharply enough to wake a sleeping person. There was a pause of approximately 4 seconds. Then his voice, low and alert in a way that told her he had not been fully asleep either. Or if he had the kind of reflexes that surface quickly from it. "Come in." She opened the door. He was sitting up, a lamp already lit beside the bed. He had reached for it without fumbling, which meant it was a familiar motion, and he was looking at her with the full attention of someone who had learned to take late-night knocking seriously. She held up the letter. "Callum missed this," she said. "It was in the bottom of the last folder. I need you to read it." He looked at her face before he looked at the letter. Whatever he saw there made him get out of bed without a word, cross the room in 3 steps, and take the document from her hands. She watched his face as he read it. She watched the first paragraph produce nothing visible. She watched the second produce a very slight tightening around his eyes. She watched him reach the third paragraph, and she watched his face go through a sequence of things in approximately 3 seconds. Recognition, confirmation of a fear that had apparently been present without evidence for some time, and then, below that, something rawer and less organized that he contained before it fully surfaced. He looked up. "Pembroke," he said. His voice was very quiet. "You know him." "I've met him. At Gerald's." He looked back at the letter. "Pembroke attends Gerald's dinners. I thought he was simply a—" He stopped. His jaw worked once. "I thought he was simply a friend of Gerald's." "He is," Vivienne said, "a well-compensated one." The lamplight moved across the document in his hands. "They've been poisoning me," he said. The sentence was flat, stated without performance, the way people sometimes state the things that are too large for the available emotional architecture, the grief or rage or terror that has outgrown any container the body was prepared to provide. "Yes," she said, "and we now have it documented." He looked at her. His face, in the lamplight, at midnight, in a house full of people who might or might not be positioned to finish what had been started, was the face of a man who had just had the distance between himself and his own death reduced to a piece of paper and 3 clinical paragraphs. And she saw something in him in that moment that she would not see him show in company, in daylight, in the careful management of his daily presentation to the world, the sheer, unguarded weight of it. "Vivienne," he said. Her name, not her title, the first time. "I know," she said. Outside the window, the Shropshire dark was total and still and going nowhere. Below in the kitchen, something moved. A creak of a floorboard, slow and deliberate, at an hour when no member of the household staff had reason to be awake. They both heard it. Nathaniel's eyes met hers across the width of the room. In his hand, the letter. Under the house, the sound moved again, closer now, in the direction of the stairs. The sound came again. Not a settling creak, The house had its own language for that, the low structural vocabulary of old stone adjusting to cold, and Vivienne had spent enough of the night awake to have already catalogued it. This was different. This was weight distributed deliberately, the specific sound of a person who was trying not to make one. Nathaniel moved first. He set the letter on the bedside table with a precision that was itself a decision, not hiding it, not clutching it, simply placing it where he could return to it, and crossed to the wardrobe in 4 silent steps. She watched him pull out a coat, and from behind it, something she had not expected, a short fireplace poker, iron, old, kept there with the intentional placement of a man who had been sleeping poorly in his own house for some time and had made adjustments accordingly. "Stay here," he said. "No," she said. He looked at her. The lamp was low, and the room was mostly shadow, and his face in it was stripped of every social accommodation. No management, no measured delivery, just the direct animal attention of a person running threat assessment. "You don't know this house," he said. "You're still ill," she said, "and whoever is on those stairs is aware of that." A beat. He did not argue it, which told her he had already run the same calculation. She pulled her robe tighter and looked around the room. The lamp, the letter on the table. Her eyes went to the writing desk in the corner, a small brass letter opener, useless against anything serious but better than standing empty-handed in a dark hallway. She picked it up. Nathaniel watched her do this, and something moved across his face that she could not name and did not try to. He moved to the bedroom door, put his hand flat against it for a moment, listening, then opened it by inches. The corridor was dark. The house at midnight had extinguished all its working lights, and what remained was the ambient gray of cloud-diffused moonlight coming through the window at the far end of the hall, barely enough to read shapes. She came up beside him, and they stood at the threshold together, listening to the dark. The stair creak again, closer, one landing below, moving up. Nathaniel stepped into the corridor, and she followed. He knew the house the way people know the houses they grew up in, not by thinking about where to put their feet, but by some older knowledge that operates below thought. He moved without hesitation, without checking for obstacles, in the specific, confident, dark navigation of a man who had run these hallways as a child and still carried the map in his body. She stayed close, one hand briefly finding his arm to calibrate her position, then releasing it. They reached the top of the stairs. Below, on the second landing, a shape resolved out of the dark. A figure stopped, having apparently heard them arrive above. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. 3 people in the dark of a stairwell, each one listening to the others breathe. Then the figure turned and ran. Nathaniel went after them without a word. Vivienne was half a step behind him on the stairs, the brass letter opener stupid and useless in her hand, and the cold of the stone floor coming up through her feet, and her heart doing something loud and undignified in her chest that she refused to let into her face. The figure hit the ground floor running and went left, toward the back of the house, toward the kitchen passage. Nathaniel caught him at the passage door. Not a tackle, not a fight. More the controlled application of reach and leverage that comes from having a height advantage and a working knowledge of the geography. He got a hand into the figure's collar, and the wall did the rest. The impact was brief and definitive. The figure, a man, she could see now, youngish, wearing a kitchen worker's clothing, went still with the particular stillness of someone who has just had the option of continued resistance efficiently removed. She reached them. The lamp from the passage threw a narrow wedge of light across the scene. Nathaniel had the man against the wall, forearm across his chest, iron poker held where it could be seen. His breathing was elevated but controlled. She could see the management of it, the conscious suppression of a body that was, in fact, less physically capable than it had been a year ago, but was refusing to let that be the operative fact of the current moment. The man against the wall was maybe 22. Brown hair, pale now, eyes doing the fast calculation of someone assessing whether a lie is still viable. His hands were open at his sides, the body's involuntary signal for "I am not currently a threat," which Vivienne recognized as less a statement of character than a response to immediate physics. "Name," Nathaniel said. Flat, direct, no performance of anger in it, which was actually more threatening than anger would have been. The young man's eyes moved to Vivienne, then back. Thomas, sir, your grace. I'm in the kitchen. I know who you are, Nathaniel said. I want to know what you were doing on my stairs at midnight. Thomas's eyes did the calculation again. She watched him run through the available options and find each one insufficient. Couldn't sleep, he said. Try again. There was something I needed from Thomas. Nathaniel's voice dropped by half a register, which somehow made it carry more. I'm going to ask you one more time, and I want you to understand that I have, in the past 2 hours, come into possession of information that significantly changes my patience for certain kinds of answers. Thomas looked at him. Then something collapsed in the young man's face. Not dramatically, not theatrically, just the small, specific surrender of a person who has been holding a position they knew was untenable and has decided the cost of continuing to hold it is no longer worth the effort. Mr. Gerald's man came to the kitchen last week, Thomas said. He said to put something in the Duke's morning tea. He gave me a packet. The words were coming quickly now, in the flat, rapid delivery of someone who has shifted from lying to unburdening. He said it was a tonic for the illness. He said his Grace's doctor had prescribed it, but his Grace wouldn't take it willingly. Vivienne's hand had tightened on the letter opener. She was aware of this, but did not release it. Where is the packet now? Nathaniel said. In my kit. In the kitchen. I didn't put it in anything yet. Thomas's voice had developed a quality she recognized. The high, thin register of a young person realizing, too late, the full dimensions of what they had agreed to. He paid me. £20. I didn't think it was... What's his name? Vivienne said. Both men looked at her. Gerald's man, the one who paid you. What is his name? Thomas blinked. Reston. Mr. Reston. He's been at Ravenshire House before. I've seen him with Mr. Gerald. Nathaniel did not look at her, but she felt the information land in him. The way the body receives a fact it has already suspected. The small muscle adjustment that is not quite surprise. You're going to get the packet, Nathaniel said to Thomas. You're going to bring it to me, sealed as you received it. And then you're going to tell Callum everything Reston said to you, every word from the beginning. And if I discover you've left anything out... He stopped. Let the unfinished sentence do the work that a finished one would have done less efficiently. Do you understand me? Yes, Your Grace. Go. Thomas went, unsteady on his feet, in the direction of the kitchen. Nathaniel stepped back from the wall and stood in the passage for a moment, the iron poker at his side, the lamplight catching the side of his face. She looked at him. She was looking for the physical cost of what had just happened, the toll on a body that was being systematically depleted and had just spent 60 seconds in acute physical exertion at midnight. She saw it, carefully contained, a slight tension around his jaw, a controlled evenness in his breathing that was manufactured rather than natural. He caught her looking. I'm fine, he said. I'm not checking if you're fine, she said. I'm assessing what we can do next, and how quickly. The distinction landed. He nodded once. Reston, she said. Tell me. He's been Gerald's man for 4 years. Runs errands, carries messages. The kind of position that doesn't appear on any formal household record because the work it involves isn't the kind you put in writing. His voice was even. I've seen him twice. He didn't register as significant. He registered as forgettable, Vivienne said, which is exactly what he was supposed to do. Yes. Gerald used someone you wouldn't remember to approach someone you wouldn't watch. She was thinking through the structure of it, the deliberate layering of insulation between the source and the action. If Thomas had been discovered, Reston is the next name. If Reston is discovered, he's a freelance man with no documented connection to your cousin. Gerald is 3 steps removed. Nathaniel looked at her in the low light. You think like someone who has been managed. The sentence was blunt and accurate, and she received it the way she had learned to receive accurate things. I've had a thorough education, she said. Callum was awake when they reached his room. He opened the door before Nathaniel finished knocking, dressed, lamp already lit. A man who had apparently decided that this house required sleeping in a state of readiness and had adjusted his habits accordingly. He absorbed the situation in approximately 5 seconds. The letter, which Nathaniel handed him, the summary of Thomas, the name Reston. She watched him read the letter. His face went through nothing visible, but his hands changed. A barely perceptible tightening, the way a person's grip shifts when the weight of what they're holding becomes suddenly real. He set the letter down on his own desk with the careful placement of something that has just become the most important document in the room. Pembroke's attended 6 of Gerald's dinners, Callum said. I have the dates. I have a footman who served 4 of them. You have a footman, Nathaniel said. James. He's been feeding me information for 3 months. Gerald's household staff is not as loyal to Gerald as Gerald believes. Callum's voice had the specific, dry precision of a man who has been doing something difficult without resources for a long time and has developed a certain economy around discussing it. Thomas was a gap in my picture. I knew Reston had been to the kitchen. I didn't know the nature of it. You knew Reston had been here, Vivienne said. Callum looked at her. I was working to establish what for. What else are you working to establish that hasn't been briefed? A pause. Brief, but actual. Lady Hargreave, he said. He said it to Vivienne, which meant he had already connected the same thread Nathaniel had connected earlier and had been carrying it. I have one letter sent from your aunt's house to Hargreaves, dated approximately 2 months before the Fenwick report reached London society. I have not been able to establish the full content. The letter was obtained through a parlor maid who copied the salutation and the closing and could recall only partial phrases from the body. What phrases? Vivienne said. Her voice stayed flat. The Ashcroft girl was one. Fenwick has confirmed was another. Callum met her eyes steadily. I'm sorry. She held the steadiness of the moment. She was 27 years old, and she had spent the past year and a half walking through the wreckage of a reputation that 2 people had chosen to dismantle because she was useful wreckage, and the demolition had been inexpensive. She sat with it the way you sit with a burn, letting the full surface area of it register without flinching away from the extent, and then she put it somewhere functional. That letter, she said, is going to be the one that ends Henrietta Morrow. Neither man responded immediately. Then Callum said, The parlor maid is still in service there. Does she understand what she has? She understood enough to give it to me. Then she understands enough to give a full account when the time comes. Vivienne looked at the letter from Pembroke still on Callum's desk. We have 3 things. We have this. We have Thomas's testimony and the packet he's bringing, which, if it contains what Pembroke's letter describes, is physical evidence of attempted poisoning, and we have the financial records from the folder. She paused. What we don't have is a chain of documentation that puts Gerald's hand directly on any of it. Everything is 1 layer removed. Which is the design, Nathaniel said. Yes, so we need someone closer to Gerald than Reston. She looked at Callum. James? The footman. How close is he to Gerald's actual household operations? Callum considered. Close enough to have overheard. Then we need him to start listening with a specific purpose. Callum looked at Nathaniel. Something passed between them. The particular communication of 2 people who have been trusting each other in difficult circumstances long enough to have developed a shorthand for it. She's right, Nathaniel said. Simply. Thomas came back with the packet at midnight. It was a small paper envelope sealed with plain wax, unmarked. Callum opened it with a penknife and examined the contents without touching them. A pale powder, finer than salt, odorless at the distance he maintained from it. He rewrapped it in a clean cloth and set it aside with the deliberate care of someone handling a thing whose exact nature they didn't want absorbed into their skin. Thomas gave his account to Callum with Vivienne present. She sat across from the young man and watched him talk. She was not there to comfort him. She left that human function to Callum's quiet, steady presence, but to watch the account for gaps, for the places where the story moved too smoothly or hesitated in a way that suggested management rather than memory. Thomas was not a sophisticated liar. He He was a frightened 22-year-old who had made a decision for £20 and had not thought it through to its conclusion, which was the ordinary human failure of people who needed money and were offered it by people who understood how need works. The account was consistent. Reston had been friendly, had framed the request as a medical matter, had provided the money before asking for the action rather than after, the classic structure of corruption that prioritized commitment over incentive. Thomas had not asked enough questions because the framing had been designed to make questions seem unnecessary. "Did Reston say anything about what would happen if you refused?" Vivienne asked. Thomas looked at his hands. "He said Mr. Gerald would be disappointed. He said Mr. Gerald had been good to the estate and that people who were good to the estate remembered who had been cooperative." A pause. "He said the Duke might be making changes to staff in the new year." The implication was clean and unsophisticated and effective. Cooperate or lose your position. Gerald's people had correctly assessed that Thomas's loyalty to the household was financial rather than personal, and had offered both a carrot and a stick sized to the specific architecture of his circumstances. "You're not going to lose your position," Nathaniel said from the doorway. He had been standing there for the last several minutes in the half-dark of the corridor, listening. His voice was neutral, without the warmth of reassurance or the edge of threat, just a plain statement of what was going to happen. Thomas looked up. "You're going to do exactly what Callum tells you. Answer any questions asked of you fully and accurately, and you're going to say nothing to anyone about tonight, in exchange for which your employment here continues and this," Nathaniel's eyes moved to the wrapped cloth on the desk, "is handled as a matter for appropriate authorities and not as a criminal matter involving your direct participation." He paused. "That offer exists only as long as your cooperation is complete." Thomas nodded. He was the color of old plaster. "Go to bed," Nathaniel said. The young man left. Callum looked at the wrapped cloth and the letter and the financial documents arranged on his desk, and his face had the quality of a man staring at a thing he has been building toward for 8 months and is only now seeing assembled in the same room. "It's enough to take to a solicitor," Callum said. "In the morning." "Not Ashcroft's solicitor," Vivienne said. Both men looked at her. "My family's solicitor has a relationship with Constance Ashcroft, and Constance Ashcroft did not ask enough questions about this arrangement to be certain she has no entanglement in it. I'm not saying she's complicit. I'm saying she is manageable, and manageable people sometimes make decisions that serve their comfort over other considerations." She looked at Nathaniel. "Who is your solicitor?" "Hargreaves and Pell in the city." She paused. "Hargreave," she said. A silence. "Different spelling," Nathaniel said, but his jaw had tightened. "Is there any connection?" "I don't know." His voice was very quiet, and the quiet of it was not calm. It was the quality of a man who has just seen the edge of something that might be significantly larger than the thing he thought he was looking at. "I have used Hargreaves and Pell for 6 years, before the illness." "Then we need to verify the connection before we take anything to them." She met his eyes. "We need a solicitor with no prior relationship to anyone in this picture. Someone recommended by a party entirely outside this network." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. She understood what was happening in that moment. She had watched it progress over the past several hours, this gradual recalibration, the way a person who has been operating alone in a dangerous situation adjusts to the introduction of a partner whose judgment they are finding, incrementally, to be reliable. It was not trust yet. It was the beginning of the architecture of trust, the first structural members going in. "There is a man in Birmingham," Callum said, "a solicitor. He handled a matter for my father 12 years ago. He has no London connections that I'm aware of." "Then he's who we use," Vivienne said. Nathaniel nodded. She looked at the window. Outside, the sky was doing the first gray thing that happens before dawn. Not light yet, but the withdrawal of absolute dark, the atmosphere making its slow preparation. "Get some sleep," she said to Callum. "Both of you." She looked at Nathaniel specifically. "You need to eat in the morning, and I need to be present when you do. And I need to speak to Mrs. Hartley before breakfast about the kitchen staff's full history and who has had access to the house since your illness began." "Mrs. Hartley has been with this household for," Nathaniel started. "I'm not questioning her loyalty," Vivienne said. "I'm asking her to help me build a picture. Those are different things, and she will understand the difference." He looked at her. Then he said, "You should have been a general." "I should have been many things," she said. "Go to sleep." She did not sleep. She sat at the writing desk in the connecting sitting room with the lamp turned low and the Pembroke letter in front of her, and she worked through the structure of it one more time, looking for what they were missing, looking for the load-bearing element that, if removed, would bring the whole construction down rather than just damaging its surface. The poison was the most dangerous piece, not because of what it had done, but because of what it meant about timing. If Gerald had authorized an active poisoning attempt 14 months ago and the illness had been progressing on a managed schedule since then, there was a reason Reston had come to the kitchen this week specifically. Something had changed in Gerald's timeline. Something had accelerated his need. The marriage. She sat with this. The marriage had introduced a new variable, a wife, a co-interest in the estate, a complication in the succession that Gerald had not fully accounted for or had underestimated. And Gerald's response to an unanticipated variable had been to accelerate, which meant Gerald was not as patient as his methodology suggested. Underneath the careful layering, the insulating structure, the plausible deniability, underneath all of it was a man who panicked when his plan was disrupted. Panicking men made errors. She needed Gerald to panic more. The shape of something began to form in her mind. Not a plan yet, more like the outline of one. The first indication of where the walls might go. It required London. It required the social season that was, even now, beginning to accelerate toward its midwinter engagements. It required Gerald and Henrietta to be watched from a position neither of them expected to be occupied. It required Vivienne Ashcroft, disgraced and dismissed and written off, to walk back into the rooms that had destroyed her and be something they hadn't prepared for. Her hands were flat on the desk. The lamp threw its circle of light. Somewhere outside, the first birds were beginning. She thought about what they had called it. The marriage. A mercy, a dignified burial, two broken people making a quiet end. She thought about what it had actually become in the space of one night. A woman who had been told she was nothing, and a man who had been told he was dying, sitting in a room together at 3 a.m. with evidence of a conspiracy and a warrant for ending it. Not broken. Reforged into something the people who'd tried to bury them had never considered. She was still sitting there when Nathaniel knocked on the connecting door at dawn, a full hour before anyone should have been awake. She said, "Come in." He entered, dressed, with the careful movement of a man whose body was rationing its resources and had decided this morning's expenditure was worth the cost. He looked at her, at the lamp still burning, at the letter in front of her, at her face that had apparently broadcast something she had not intended, and he crossed the room to the other chair and sat down. He did not ask if she had slept. He could see the answer. "We need to go to London," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said. "Gerald needs to see us, together, in the rooms that matter." "Yes. It needs to be before he finds out that Thomas didn't deliver the packet. Once he knows, his window for action narrows, and he becomes unpredictable in ways that are harder to manage." Agreed. His voice was level, but she could hear the specific quality underneath the level, the thing that was not fear but was adjacent to it, the awareness of a man who understood that returning to London meant returning to the arena where the people who wanted him dead had the most power and the best intelligence. "I know what I'm asking," she said. "I know you do." He held her gaze across the desk. "That's not the problem." "What is?" He was quiet for a moment. The dawn light was coming through the window now, proper light, cold and direct. "The last time I was in London," he said, "I had to leave because I was not well enough to manage a full social engagement. Gerald saw that. Henrietta saw it. Every room I walked into, I could feel them calculating the distance between where I was and where they needed me to be." His voice did not waver, but it carried something that had not been in it the night before, a rawness that was costing him something to produce. "I need you to understand that I may not—" "You're not going back as the man who was dying," she said. He stopped. "You're going back as the man who has evidence," she said. "Those are different people with different walking speeds." Something shifted in the room. The lamp was unnecessary now. The dawn had taken its function. And in the clean, cold morning light, his face was tired and certain, and underneath both, something that was beginning to resemble the very dangerous quality of a person who has stopped waiting for the outcome to be decided for them. "We leave Thursday," he said. She nodded. Vivienne. Her name again, the way he had said it the night before. Not her title, the actual name, the one that had been attached to her before London decided what it was worth. "What they did to you, when this is finished, she said, they will account for all of it. Everything." Her voice was quiet and total, carrying no performance of threat, just the flat declaration of a conclusion already reached. "Not as a favor to me, as a fact." He looked at her. Outside, the Shropshire morning was arriving in its full cold clarity. The fields, the bare trees, the kitchen garden, holding its geometry in the low slanted light. The house was beginning to wake, the first sounds of the below-stairs day starting its rotation. And somewhere in London, Gerald Ravenshire was reading his morning correspondence, adjusting his plans, managing his investments, moving pieces across a board he believed he controlled, unaware that the two pieces he had written off as already lost had spent the night assembling the exact shape of his undoing. He would learn. Not yet. But soon, and without warning, in the room he least expected, in front of the audience he most needed to impress, he would learn what it cost to bury people who refused to stay buried. They arrived in London on a Thursday. Ravenshire House in Grosvenor Square had been opened ahead of them. Callum had sent word to the skeleton staff 2 days prior, enough time for the rooms to be aired and the fires to be laid, but not enough time for the news of their arrival to have fully circulated through the social networks that fed on exactly this kind of information. Vivienne had calculated the window deliberately. They needed to be present before Gerald knew they were coming. They needed the advantage of the first move. The house was grander than she had expected and quieter than its grandeur implied. 6 stories of Portland stone, the kind of London address that announced itself without effort, that had been announcing itself for 140 years and had never needed to raise its voice to do it. She walked through the front door behind Nathaniel and felt the house receive them, or receive him, the way a place that has known a person for a long time receives their return, with the specific wordless recognition of walls that remember. The staff was small. 4 people in permanent residence. A butler named Graves, who had the compressed authority of someone who had kept this house running through significant difficulty and intended to keep doing so. A housekeeper. 2 maids. They stood in the entrance hall with the same quality she had observed at Alderley. Loyalty without performance, people who were here because they had decided to be rather than because they had nowhere better to go. Graves looked at Nathaniel with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally relieved. He looked at Vivienne with an expression that was professionally welcoming and personally assessing. "Your Grace," he said to both of them, the plural form of it handled with a smoothness that told her Graves had been running this house for long enough to manage transitions without telegraphing his position on them. "Everything has been prepared. Mr. Callum's instructions were thorough." "Thank you, Graves." Nathaniel's hand rested briefly on the newel post of the staircase. A gesture too small to be deliberate, she thought, just the body's private acknowledgement of a familiar surface. Then he straightened. "We'll need the study this afternoon. No interruptions." "Of course." She followed Nathaniel up the stairs and said nothing about the way he took them, measured, each step considered in a way that was not labored but was careful, the specific economy of a body managing its reserves against an unknown expenditure ahead. The Birmingham solicitor's name was Aldous Crane. He arrived the following morning, having traveled overnight at Callum's urgent request, and he was not what Vivienne had expected. He was small, 60-ish, with the kind of face that had stopped being remarkable 30 years ago and had turned that invisibility into an asset. He wore a coat that was good, but not advertised. He sat down across from Nathaniel in the study without the preliminary social architecture that most professional men deployed in rooms of this kind, the careful calibration of deference and competence. And he simply looked at what was placed in front of him. He read the Pembroke letter twice. He reviewed the financial documents without comment for 20 minutes. He looked at the sealed cloth containing the powder, which Callum had transported in a locked case, without touching it. Then he set his hands flat on the desk and said, "Who else has seen these materials?" The The three people in this room, Nathaniel said. Callum, Thomas, who provided the packet, a parlor maid in Lady Morrow's household who does not know the full picture. The parlor maid needs to be brought in, Crane said. Her partial account is a liability until it's a fully documented one. Partial witnesses are the first tool used to discredit. He looked at the powder. This needs to go to a chemist I trust in Holborn today. If it contains what this letter describes, I need that analysis documented before the end of the week. Why the end of the week? Vivienne said. Crane looked at her with the direct attention of a man recalibrating a room. Because the Ravenshire Estate's quarterly review is scheduled for the 15th. Gerald Morrow Ravenshire has, based on what I'm reading here, positioned himself to have primary oversight of that review in the Dukes, in your husband's absence from London affairs. He looked at Nathaniel. If he conducts that review before we have documented evidence in front of a magistrate, he will have legally processed transactions that will be considerably more difficult to reverse. Nathaniel's jaw was set. I was not aware of a quarterly review. You wouldn't have been, necessarily. The notice was sent to your solicitor. Hargreaves and Pell, Vivienne said. Crane looked at her. Something moved across his face. You've considered that connection. We've considered it. Then you've considered correctly. He paused. I have no documented evidence of impropriety at Hargreaves and Pell. What I have is a professional relationship between the senior partner and a member of Lady Morrow's husband's former club that is, let us say, notable in context. He folded his hands. I would not submit these materials through Hargreaves and Pell under any circumstances. No, Nathaniel agreed. Then we move quickly. Crane was already gathering the documents back into their order with the efficient motion of a man whose relationship with urgency was long established and functional. The chemist today, the parlor maid, can she be reached without alerting the Morrow household? Callum has that, Vivienne said. Good. Crane stood. He looked at Vivienne for a moment with an expression that was, beneath its professional surface, something more considered. You should be prepared for what happens when Gerald becomes aware you're in London and taking action. Men like this, patient, methodical, insulated, they become a different animal when they understand the game has changed. He paused. A more dangerous one. I know, she said. They were in London 4 days before Gerald found out. She knew the exact moment it happened because she was at Lady Ashford's afternoon reception when she saw his face across the room change. The reception had been Vivienne's idea, not a full social re-entry. So, not yet. Not until the evidence was secured and documented, but a calculated visibility, a signal to the network that the Duchess of Ravenshire was in London and was present and was not behaving like a woman who understood herself to be finished. Lady Ashford was a careful choice, old family, no financial entanglement with the Ravenshire estate, and a woman who had known Vivienne's grandmother and therefore received her with a warmth that the rest of the room had to calculate around. Gerald was there because of course he was. It was that kind of reception, the midwinter social calendar doing its obligatory work of assembling the relevant parties in decorated rooms and giving them access to each other's faces. He was across the room when he saw her. She watched it happen. The recognition first, and under it, fast, like a fish moving below clear water, the reassessment. He had built his entire current strategy on the premise that Vivienne Ashcroft Ravenshire was a woman whose position was decorative and whose function was to add a wife's name to an estate while everything of substance happened around her. He had built it on the reasonable assumption that a woman who had spent a year being systematically destroyed would be too occupied with her own surviving to look outward. He looked at her face and understood that something had gone wrong with that premise. He crossed the room in 3 minutes. She watched him come, and she stood with the quality of stillness she had spent the past year developing. Not the stillness of a frightened woman making herself small, but the other kind, the one that required the same muscular effort and produced a different effect entirely. Gerald Ravenshire was 41, soft in the face in the way that certain kinds of careful living produce, with light eyes that were intelligent and, she saw now with the new resolution of someone who understood what she was looking at, cold in a specific way. The coldness of a person for whom other people had always primarily been instruments. Duchess. He stopped to correct social distance from her and produced a smile that was technically perfect, What a genuine pleasure. We had not heard you were in London. No, she said. You hadn't. The smile held. Under it, something worked. Nathaniel is well, I hope. He has seemed... We have all been so concerned about his health. The winter is particularly difficult for... Nathaniel is quite well, she said. Her voice was level, and she let it carry exactly what she intended. Not hostility, which would give him information, but an absence of the expected social softness. The blankness of a person who is not performing welcome because they have decided it would be inaccurate to do so. Something shifted in his eyes. Minute, controlled. I'm so glad. We must all have dinner soon. Now that you're both in town, I'm sure Aunt Henrietta would be delighted to. I'm sure she would, Vivienne said. Then she smiled at someone across the room, excused herself with the composed ease of a woman who has simply run out of interest in the current conversation, and walked away from Gerald Ravenshire without looking back. She felt his eyes on her back for the full 30 feet. That was Thursday. On Friday, Crane's chemist confirmed the powder. Crane sent word via a sealed note delivered to Ravenshire House by a man Vivienne had not seen before and did not ask about. She read it once, handed it to Nathaniel, and watched him read it with the same flat expression she had watched him produce for everything else. The face of a man who has learned that the distance between his own composure and the thing underneath it is an asset to be managed. The compound was consistent with Pembroke's description. Administered over time in small quantities, it would have produced exactly the symptoms Nathaniel had been experiencing. The fatigue, the muscular weakness, the episodes of confusion that had occurred in the early months. A physician, without specific knowledge of the compound, would have found nothing inconsistent with a natural degenerative process. The chemist had documented his findings in full and was prepared to provide expert testimony. Crane was at the magistrate's office that afternoon. They had 3 days before the quarterly review. The parlor maid's name was Agnes. Callum brought her to Ravenshire House on Friday evening through the service entrance in the company of her sister, who had been employed at Alderley for 4 years and was the thread through which Callum had first made contact. Agnes was 20, terrified, and possessed of a memory that was, under Crane's careful and patient questioning, considerably more detailed than the partial account Callum had originally received. She had not merely copied the salutation and closing of the letter between Henrietta Morrow and Lady Hargreave. She had read most of it. She had been frightened to say so because reading Lady Morrow's correspondence was a terminable offense, and she had not fully understood until now that what she had read was the more serious matter. The letter had been explicit, not explicit in the manner of someone careless, explicit in the manner of someone who trusted their recipient completely and had therefore not bothered with the insulating language that characterized the rest of the conspiracy's communications. It named Fenwick. It named the Ashcroft examination. It described, in Henrietta Morrow's precise social cursive, the desired outcome: a ruined girl married to a dying man, the estate's transition to Gerald's management uncontested, the whole arrangement concluded before anyone thought to look carefully at what had actually occurred. And it contained one additional element that none of them had anticipated. It mentioned a second examination, not Vivienne's. An earlier one, a young woman, unnamed 3 years prior, who had been assessed by Fenwick and whose assessment had served a different purpose in a different arrangement. The letter referenced it only obliquely as evidence of Fenwick's reliability, but it existed. Another life in another ledger, adjusted by the same hand. Vivienne sat with this for a long time after Agnes had been taken to a safe room and Crane had finished his documentation. The room was quiet. Callum had gone. Nathaniel was across the desk from her, watching her face in the way he had developed over the past weeks. Not the assessment of the first day, but something more careful, something that had learned the specific grammar of her expressions well enough to know when she was working through something that was not purely tactical. "There's someone else," she said. "Yes." "Fenwick has done this before, to someone we don't know." "Yes." She looked at the fire. The thing that was moving through her was not clean anger. Anger had a useful simplicity to it, a direction. This was more complicated, the recognition of a system, the understanding that what had been done to her had not been improvised or singular, but was a practiced methodology, that she had been one instance of something that had been done before and left unchecked would be done again. She had entered this as a woman trying to clear her own name. She was looking at something larger than her name. "Crane needs to know," she said. "I'll tell him in the morning." "Tonight," she said. "We have 2 days before the quarterly review, and whatever we bring to the magistrate needs to be complete. If there's another documented instance of Fenwick providing fabricated assessments for payment, that is not a supporting detail. That is the case." Nathaniel looked at her. Then he stood and went to the door to find someone to send for Crane. Saturday arrived in London with the gray-specific quality of a city that does not have seasons so much as variations of the same sustained overcast, and it was on Saturday morning that everything went wrong. She was at the writing desk at 7 when Graves knocked and entered with the expression of a man who had received news he understood was significant and was managing the management of it. "A Mr. Reston is at the door, Your Grace," he said. "He says he has an urgent message for the Duke from Mr. Gerald Ravenshire, and that it must be delivered personally." Vivienne looked at Graves. "Tell him to wait," she said. She went to Nathaniel's apartment and knocked. He was already awake. She told him, in 4 sentences, what was at the door. His face did the thing it did. The brief compression, the calculation. "We don't receive Reston," he said. "No, but we need to know what Gerald knows and when he knew it." She paused. "Send Callum." Callum spoke with Reston in the entrance hall for 3 minutes. Reston left. Callum came upstairs. "Gerald wants a meeting," Callum said. "Today, private. He knows about Crane." The room contracted around this information. "How?" Nathaniel said. "Reston didn't say. Gerald knows Crane was at the magistrate's office yesterday. He knows there was a chemical analysis conducted. He knows—" Callum paused, and in the pause was the specific quality of a man about to deliver something he does not want to deliver. "He knows about the Pembroke letter." Silence. It lasted long enough to be its own full presence in the room. "That's not possible," Nathaniel said. His voice was very quiet. 3 people knew about that letter. 4, including Crane. The chemist was not told its content. "I know," Callum said. "Agnes," Vivienne said. "Agnes didn't know about the letter." Callum's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that was careful and controlled and cost him effort to keep that way. "Agnes provided her account last night. Reston arrived this morning. The timing is not Agnes," Nathaniel said. Everyone in the room understood what he was not saying. Vivienne looked at the 2 of them. She looked at Callum's face, at the contained quality of it, the deliberate steadiness, and she understood that she was watching a man who had already run the available possibilities and had arrived at a conclusion he was not yet willing to state. "Who knew?" she said. Her voice was flat. "Who knew about the letter specifically? List them." "You," Callum said. "The Duke. Myself. Crane." He stopped. "Crane," Nathaniel said. "I don't believe it's Crane," Callum said. "Crane's reputation is—" "His reputation was established before Gerald's money was involved," Vivienne said. She said it without inflection. The room needed accurate information more than it needed consideration for anyone's feelings about what that information implied. Nathaniel stood up. He walked to the window and stood with his back to the room for a moment, looking at the gray London morning. His hands were at his sides and still. She watched his back. She understood what was in front of him. The specific version of this that was hardest to sit with, which was not that Gerald had learned about the letter, but that someone in his circle of trust had told him. Trust, in Nathaniel's world, was not an abundant commodity. He had spent 14 months narrowing it to the people in this room. The possibility that the narrowing had not been sufficient was not an abstract threat. It was a direct assault on the one thing he had believed was solid. "It could be Crane," she said. "We need to behave as if it could be Crane until we know otherwise. That means the materials need to leave this house today." Nathaniel turned. "If Gerald knows what we have," she continued, "he will move to intercept it before we reach the magistrate. Whether through Crane or through some other mechanism, he will move. We have hours, not days." She looked at Callum. Is there somewhere the documents can go that is not this house and is not reachable through anyone Gerald currently knows we've spoken to? Callum thought. My father's former solicitor in Holborn, not Crane, a different man, retired, still maintains his office. He owes me a considerable personal debt. Go, Nathaniel said. Callum left. The room was suddenly very quiet. Vivienne stood and began moving toward the door. Where are you going? Nathaniel said. To speak to Graves about the house's entry points. She stopped. Gerald's meeting request. He said today and private. He will send again when he doesn't receive a response. When he does, tell him yes. She met Nathaniel's eyes. Tell him yes, this evening, at his club. Not here. Neutral territory with witnesses. And then? And then we walk in there with nothing he doesn't already know we have, because everything he doesn't know is going to be somewhere he can't reach it. Her voice was steady, and the steadiness was real. Not performed, not managed, just the clean, functional quality of a person who has moved past the point where panic is a useful option. He thinks he's one step ahead of us. He needs to keep thinking that until we're ready to show him he isn't. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. He's going to come at you, he said. The words were direct and specific, stripped of every social accommodation. In that room tonight, whatever he says to me, he will use you. Your reputation, the things he had done to you. He'll use them as leverage because that's what he has, and he knows it still has the capacity to— Let him, she said. Vivienne, let him use it. Her voice was very quiet and total. Every word he says about me in that room is a word that documents itself. Every claim he makes that relies on Fenwick's assessment is another weight on the same scale we are building. She paused. I have been afraid of what he knows about me for over a year. I'm finished with that. She held his gaze without moving. Are you finished being afraid of what he knows about you? The silence between them had a quality that was different from the silences that had preceded it. Not the silence of two people negotiating terms, but the silence of two people who have arrived at the same place at the same time and are acknowledging it without needing to make a ceremony of the acknowledgement. Yes, he said. Then tonight we walk into his room and we give him nothing. She put her hand on the door. And when it's over, we go to the magistrate ourselves, with or without Crane. She opened the door. In the entrance hall below, Graves was speaking in a low voice to someone. She heard Graves' controlled professional tone, and then, cutting through it, another voice, a woman's, with the specific carrying quality of a person accustomed to rooms arranging themselves around her arrival. Vivienne went to the top of the stairs and looked down. Standing in the entrance hall of Ravenshire House, removing her gloves with the unhurried authority of someone who had never in 60 years of life been uncertain of her welcome anywhere, was Henrietta Morrow. Lady Morrow looked up. Their eyes met across the full height of the staircase. My dear, Henrietta said. Her voice was warm and entirely without warmth. How fortunate. I had so hoped to find you at home. She smiled the smile of a woman who has arrived at exactly the moment she intended and is aware of the effect. We have such a great deal to discuss. Behind Vivienne in the study, the documents were gone. Callum had taken them 20 minutes ago. Nathaniel was in the room and would hear voices. Crane was somewhere in the city with knowledge that was either loyalty or liability. And Henrietta Morrow was standing in her entrance hall with the composed assurance of someone who believed she had already won and had come to administer the terms. Vivienne descended the stairs, step by step, down into the hall, into the room where her enemy was waiting with a smile, into the moment where every plan she and Nathaniel had assembled was either about to hold or about to shatter, and no one in the building yet knew which. Henrietta Morrow did not sit until she was invited to. This was not courtesy. It was the specific performance of a woman who understood that the person who chooses their own moment of sitting controls the room's tempo. She stood in the entrance hall of Ravenshire House with the composed authority of 60 years of social architecture behind her and let Vivienne descend the full length of the staircase under her observation. Let the descent happen at her pace, on her terms, with her eyes setting the conditions of the encounter before a word had been exchanged. Vivienne understood all of this. She descended without adjusting her speed. Lady Morrow, she said, reaching the hall floor. Her voice carried the register of a woman receiving a caller she had not invited and was not surprised by. What an unexpected morning. My dear Duchess. Henrietta's eyes moved across Vivienne's face with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had spent decades reading rooms. You look remarkably well for someone who has apparently been quite busy. The warmth in her voice was technically perfect and contained nothing warm. Shall we sit? Of course. Vivienne led her to the front drawing room, not the study, not any room that had been used for the work of the past 2 days, and sat across from her guest with her hands in her lap and her face arranged in the careful neutrality of a woman who has decided that information flows in one direction in this room, and she is the one choosing which direction. Graves brought tea that neither of them touched. I'll be direct, Henrietta said, settling her gloves across her knee with a composure that was its own form of aggression. I've heard some concerning things about activity conducted in my nephew's name, visits to certain professional offices, questions asked of certain people. She paused. I've come because I believe there has been a misunderstanding that, if left unaddressed, could prove deeply damaging to the Ravenshire name, to both your futures. That's thoughtful of you, Vivienne said. It is. No acknowledgement of the flatness in Vivienne's tone. Nathaniel has been unwell. Unwell people sometimes develop impressions, become susceptible to suggestions from those around them. Her eyes moved briefly with the precision of a thrown blade. New influences. You mean me? I mean anyone who might benefit from introducing confusion into an already difficult situation. Henrietta lifted her teacup without drinking from it. Gerald has managed the estate's affairs with considerable care during Nathaniel's illness. Whatever narrative has been constructed to suggest otherwise is, well, it would be a tragedy if it proceeded to the point of causing irreparable harm. Vivienne looked at her. She looked at the 60 years of practiced social weaponry sitting across from her in the drawing room of a house this woman had spent 14 months trying to inherit through the death of the man upstairs. She looked at the precision of it, the architecture, the way every sentence was a door that opened outward onto plausible deniability, the way the threat was embedded so thoroughly in the language of concern that extracting it would look, to any outside observer, like paranoia. She thought about Agnes, 20 years old and terrified, reading a letter she wasn't meant to read. She thought about Thomas in the passage, his face the color of old plaster. She thought about Nathaniel on the stairs at midnight, moving through his own dark house with an iron poker because the people who were supposed to love him had made it dangerous. Lady Morrow, she said. Her voice was very quiet. I want you to understand something. Henrietta waited. I came into this marriage with very little. My name had been taken from me. My position had been taken. My future had been reduced to whatever this arrangement could provide. She held the older woman's gaze without blinking. I want you to understand that a woman who has already lost everything does not respond to threats the way a woman with something to protect does. The room changed temperature by degrees too small to measure, but entirely real. Henrietta's composure held, but something behind it adjusted, a recalculation, fast and controlled. I'm not threatening anyone, my dear. You're informing me that there will be consequences if I continue in the direction I've been going. Vivienne kept her voice level. I heard you. I want you to hear me. She paused. Continue. Henrietta looked at her for a long moment. Then she set down the teacup she had never drunk from and stood, retrieving her gloves with the composed efficiency of a woman who had decided the conversation had served its purpose, which was to assess rather than to persuade. I do hope Nathaniel improves, she said. Do give him my love. She left. Vivienne sat in the drawing room after the door had closed and listened to the house settle around the departure. Then she stood and went upstairs. Nathaniel was at the study door when she reached the landing. He had heard voices. His face asked the question his mouth didn't. She came to warn us off, Vivienne said, which means she knows we're close and she's running out of insulating options. She moved past him into the study. We're not waiting for tonight. Gerald's club, his terms, that's over. We go to the magistrate today, with what we have. Crane or not Crane, we go. She turned to face him. If Crane is compromised, going without him is safer than waiting. If he isn't, he'll meet us there, or he won't. Either way, the materials are with Callum's man in Holborn, out of this house, and we walk into that office today while Gerald is still assuming he has until tonight to manage us. Nathaniel looked at her. His jaw was tight, and his eyes were doing the calculation she had watched them do a dozen times in the past week. Threat assessment, resource inventory, probability weighting, and she watched him arrive at the same answer she had. 1 hour, he said. 1 hour, she agreed. They did not make it 1 hour. Callum's note arrived 40 minutes later, delivered by a boy Vivienne didn't recognize, written in Callum's terse hand on the back of a receipt for coal. Documents intercepted in transit. Holborn. Man is unharmed. Materials gone. Do not go to the magistrate until you hear from me. Trust no one. The note was 4 lines. It contained the complete dismantling of their position. She read it twice, handed it to Nathaniel, watched him read it once. The silence in the study was total. She understood in that silence what Callum's note actually meant. Not just the loss of the documents, but the scale of Gerald's reach. The fact that he had known about the Holborn solicitor, which meant he had known about Callum's father, which meant his intelligence was not reactive but sustained, built over years into the specific shape required to cover every exit. He had not simply been managing Nathaniel's estate during the illness. He had been building a net, patient and methodical, large enough to contain every possible avenue of escape. They had been inside it the whole time. The thing that moved through Vivienne in that moment was not panic. Panic was for people who still believed the situation could be different from what it was if only they moved fast enough. What she felt was colder and more functional, the specific clarity of a person who has had every option removed except the one they hadn't yet considered because it was the most dangerous. He has the documents, she said. Yes. He'll destroy them. Not immediately. Nathaniel's voice was controlled, and she could hear the effort behind the control, the way a body manages its responses when the physical reality of a situation threatens to break through the cognitive management of it. He'll use them first. The quarterly review is Monday. He'll use the documents to establish a version of events before we can establish ours. He'll submit them as evidence of Nathaniel's, of my incompetence, my incapacity. He'll use my own evidence against me. She looked at him. Then we don't give him until Monday, she said. Vivienne, we have nothing. The letter is gone. The powder analysis is gone. Thomas is a kitchen worker whose testimony is easily discredited. Agnes is in this house, she said. Agnes is the one thing that did not go through Callum's contact. Agnes and her account. The account of a parlour-maid who admits to reading her employer's private correspondence, whose employer was conspiring to poison a duke. Her voice did not rise, but it carried. That account, given directly, in the room where it matters, in front of the people who need to hear it, is still a weapon. She held his eyes. But only if we use it before Gerald has consolidated his position. Where? Nathaniel said. The magistrate's office is not the magistrate. She felt the shape of it now, the thing that had been forming in the back of her mind since Henrietta had sat in her drawing room and delivered a threat dressed in concern. The quarterly review. He stared at her. Gerald needs the review to conduct it publicly, she said. He needs witnesses. The estate's primary creditors attend. The family solicitors attend. 3 members of the Ravenshire board attend. She paused. If we walk into that room on Monday before Gerald has called the meeting to order, the documents he stole become exhibits in a room full of people who are already there to hear evidence about the estate's condition. Nathaniel's voice had changed. The compression of it, the quality of a man pulling in from the edges and toward a center point. He'd have to produce them, or explain their absence. She took a breath. We walk in with Agnes. We walk in with Thomas, if he'll hold. We walk in with everything Callum has in his head that hasn't been written down yet. Because Callum has been building this case for 8 months, and not all of it is in those documents. She met his eyes directly. We walk in as the Duke and Duchess of Ravenshire, who have an interest in their own quarterly review and cannot be legally excluded. The study was very still. Outside, London continued its Saturday business. Carts, voices, horses, the city's indifferent forward motion. The morning light was gray and flat, and the fire had burned down to coals while they'd been standing here, and neither of them had noticed. "You understand what happens if it doesn't work," Nathaniel said. "Not a challenge, just the flat requirement of a man who needed to know she was operating with accurate information. Gerald moves to have you declared incompetent on the grounds of the illness. He takes interim control of the estate. He dismantles the case against him from the inside, uses the quarterly review to legitimize the financial transactions, and we have nothing left to take to any magistrate." She held his gaze. "I understand. And you're still saying Monday." "I'm saying we have no other option that isn't slower than his." He looked at her for a long moment. She watched him stand in the study of his own house, in the city where the people who wanted him dead were spending their Saturday preparing for Monday, and she watched him reach the point that she had reached in the drawing room downstairs, the specific place beyond which fear becomes simply another piece of information that the body processes and the mind sets aside because the alternative to setting it aside is losing. "Find Callum," he said. "Tell him Monday." Sunday passed in the specific tension of a held breath. Callum returned to Ravenshire House at midnight on Saturday, moving through the service entrance with the contained urgency of a man who had spent 12 hours retracing his steps and had found, at each retracing, more evidence of how thoroughly Gerald's intelligence had penetrated their operation. The Holborn solicitor's office had been watched for 2 days before the interception. The man Callum had trusted had not been turned. He had been followed. Gerald had not corrupted the chain, he had simply mapped it. They sat in the study until 2 in the morning, and Callum talked and Vivienne recorded, and Nathaniel held the shape of the plan in his head and assessed it from each angle the way you assess a structure you are about to put weight on. Agnes would testify. She had been told the full picture now, not managed, not protected from the scope of it, and she had received it with the specific quiet courage of a young woman who had been frightened long enough to have found the floor of it. Her account was clear and consistent, and she remembered Henrietta's handwriting and could describe 3 other letters she had seen but not read that were addressed to the same hand at the same Hargreave address. Thomas would hold. He was frightened, but he was also, Vivienne had assessed, a young man whose primary loyalty was ultimately to his own conscience, and his conscience had spent the past week making itself audible. He understood what had been in that powder now. He understood what delivering it would have meant. This knowledge had changed his face in the permanent way that certain understandings change faces. Callum had, in 8 months of private investigation, committed to memory the dates, figures, and transaction details of the financial irregularities. Written down, they had been vulnerable. Inside Callum's head, they were not. "You'll need to speak them," Vivienne said to him, near 2 in the morning. "In the room, clearly, in sequence, from memory, Gerald will challenge every number." "Let him challenge them," Callum said. "I have sources for each one." "Where are the sources?" "Here." He touched his temple. Not dramatically, simply as a statement of where he had put them for safekeeping. She looked at him and understood something about loyalty that she had not previously understood in this particular form. Not loyalty as sentiment or obligation, but as the active daily decision of a person who had looked at another person's situation and decided that the situation required their full capacity for as long as it took. 8 months. Building a case in secret for a man who was too ill to build it himself, keeping it in his head when the paper became unsafe. Callum caught her looking and said nothing. The silence between them was the kind that didn't require filling. Monday morning arrived hard and gray. They dressed in the clothes of people who understood that appearance is its own form of argument. Nathaniel, in the full formal presentation of a duke, attending a matter of estate business. Not ill, not managed, but present, exact, occupying the full vertical space of his own title. Vivienne in deep blue that was not soft, that said nothing about grief or resignation, that said instead, "I am here, and I have chosen to be, and I understand the room I am walking into." She stood at the mirror in her apartment and looked at her own face for a moment, not checking it, just meeting it. The face of a woman who had been told, systematically and from multiple directions, that she was nothing, that she was ruined, that she was an afterthought of an arrangement designed to dispose of 2 broken people quietly and without ceremony. She had met this verdict with the only available response, which was to still be standing when the people who'd issued it needed her to be gone. Nathaniel knocked on the connecting door at 8:15. She opened it. He looked at her. She looked at him. Something passed between them that was not performed and not managed. The specific acknowledgement of two people who have been in a situation long enough to know each other's precise quality of courage and are drawing on it. "Ready," she said. "Yes," he said. Odds. The Ravenshire Quarterly Review was held at the offices of Aldgate & Sons on Cornhill Street, a firm that had managed the estate's formal affairs for 30 years with the institutional solidity of an arrangement nobody had ever thought to question. The boardroom was on the second floor, a long table, 8 chairs, the kind of room where significant money had been discussed in subdued tones for decades. Gerald arrived at 9:40. He was with 2 men Vivienne didn't recognize, and his solicitor, a florid man named Pemberton, who was not Lady Pemberton's husband but shared her family's quality of performing authority without particularly earning it. He saw them at the door. The sequence of his face was visible and complete. Recognition, the very fast recalculation, then the controlled reassembly of composure over the recalculation, and finally the social surface presenting itself like a card being laid face up on a table. Nathaniel. His voice was warm and managed, and underneath both was something that she recognized now. The specific quality of a person running threat assessment in real time and not liking the results. "What a surprise. I hadn't expected. We weren't informed you'd be attending." "It's my estate," Nathaniel said. Flat, direct, no social padding. "I don't require informing." They took seats. Callum sat against the wall with his hands on his knees and his face empty of expression. Agnes was in the corridor outside, sitting with Nathaniel's housekeeper, waiting. Thomas was at Ravenshire House, also waiting in case Callum's memory needed corroborating on a specific figure. The Aldgate solicitor, a thin, careful man named Forsyth, opened the review at 10 o'clock with the procedural language of a man whose primary relationship was with the process rather than its participants. Gerald waited. He was waiting for Nathaniel to perform the role he had been performing for 14 months. Present in body, diminished in substance, capable of being managed by someone more capable of managing. He was waiting for the version of Nathaniel he had been administering around. He got a different version. "Before we proceed to the estate accounts," Nathaniel said, into the procedural opening, "I need to table a matter for the board's attention." Forsyth paused, looked up. "I have information relevant to the financial matters we'll be reviewing." Nathaniel's voice carried the full register of a man who had been Duke of Ravenshire for 6 years and had not forgotten what that meant, even on the days when his body had been attempting to convince him he was diminished. "Information that materially affects the accuracy of any accounts presented today." Gerald's solicitor leaned forward. "Your Grace, if there are concerns about the estate accounts, the appropriate process..." "The appropriate process is exactly this," Vivienne said. Heads turned. She held the room without raising her voice. "A board meeting, in front of the relevant parties, where evidence can be properly heard." She looked at the 3 creditors present, 2 men from the primary banking institutions, 1 from the estate's trust administration. "I think you'll want to hear it." Gerald looked at her across the table. She had thought she would feel something different when they were finally in the same room across a table, when the social choreography of the preceding days gave way to the actual confrontation. She had expected something hot, something charged with the accumulated weight of what his family had done to her name and her life. What she felt instead was colder and cleaner than that. The functional focus of a person who understands that the room is the weapon, and the time is now, and the next 20 minutes are going to determine everything that comes after. "Callum," she said. Callum stood up from his chair against the wall. He began to speak. He spoke for 14 minutes from memory, without hesitation, without notes, date by date, and figure by figure. The transaction history of the Ravenshire estate during Nathaniel's illness, the specific irregularities, the amounts, the accounts they had moved through, the names of the companies involved. He spoke with the specific authority of someone who has been holding a thing for 8 months and is finally setting it down in the right room. Gerald's solicitor interrupted 3 times. Each time, Callum produced the corroborating detail that answered the interruption, sourced and specific, and continued. Gerald himself said nothing. She watched him. She watched his face perform its versions of composure, and she watched, underneath them, the specific recalibration of a man who had built his entire structure on the assumption of a particular kind of weakness in the people he was managing and was discovering. Now, with the specific horror of miscalculation, that the weakness was not where he had put it. Callum finished. Forsyth was leaning forward, his pen down, his face the face of a man who had just heard enough to understand he was in a different meeting than the one he had prepared for. The two banking creditors were looking at Gerald. Gerald was looking at Nathaniel. "These are fabrications," he said. His voice was controlled and cold and carried the first real edge she had heard from him. Not the warm social performance, but the thing underneath it, the thing that had authorized the powder and the forged signatures and the careful construction of two ruined lives. "These are the fabrications of a sick man's loyal servant, motivated by—" "We have a witness," Vivienne said. Gerald's eyes moved to her. "A witness to a letter." She held his gaze. "Written from your mother's hand to Lady Hargreave, naming Dr. Fenwick, naming the nature of his instructions." She paused. "Naming me." The room was completely still. "The witness is available to give account today." She kept her voice level and her hands still. "The account includes dates, recipients, and specific language from the letter's body." She looked at Gerald. "Your mother visited me Saturday morning. I believe she came to assess whether the account existed. She left without the reassurance she came for." Gerald's face was no longer performing anything. "You have nothing," he said. His voice was very quiet. "Whatever documents you had are in the possession of your man, yes," Nathaniel said. He had not spoken in 12 minutes, and the room felt his voice arrive with the specific weight of a person who has chosen their moment. "Which is useful, because a magistrate with an interest in how those documents were obtained and how your man came to have them will find the chain of possession rather informative." Gerald stared at him. For the first time in the entirety of the encounter, Vivienne saw it. The thing beneath Gerald's architecture. The thing that all the layering and insulation and methodical patience had been built to contain. Not cruelty. Something smaller and more ordinary than cruelty. The specific fear of a man who has spent years constructing a version of reality designed to go unquestioned and is now watching it be questioned, in public, in front of the people whose opinion of him determines the shape of his life. He was calculating. She could see the calculation. Whether the denial was still viable, whether the board could be managed, whether the witness account could be discredited before it was formally given, whether Nathaniel was bluffing about the magistrate. She watched him run through the options. She watched him find each one closed. "Gerald?" Nathaniel's voice was very quiet and entirely without mercy. "It's done!" Gerald's solicitor put a hand on his client's arm. Gerald did not acknowledge the hand. He was looking at Nathaniel with the face of a man who has just understood that the thing he built his life around has stopped being true, and the specific quality of that understanding is the same regardless of whether the life was good or not. The ground going out, the years of work arriving at a terminal point, the future rewriting itself into a shape that was not the shape that was supposed to happen. Forsyth set down his pen, looked at the room, made the decision of a careful institutional man who understood which direction the weight was moving. "I believe," he said, "we will need to adjourn this review pending—" His door opened. A man entered, young, breathless, in a coat that suggested he had come from somewhere at speed. He looked at the room with the apologetic urgency of a messenger arriving in a bad moment and handed a note directly to Gerald's solicitor. The solicitor read it. His face changed. He looked at Gerald, looked back at the note. He set it on the table between them, and Gerald read it, and the room waited, and Vivienne watched Gerald's face go through something she had not seen in it before and could not entirely name. Not fear, not anger, something more fundamental. The look of a man arriving at a fact he had been certain would not arrive. Gerald set the note on the table. He stood up. "Excuse me," he said, to no one specifically, to the room as an entity, and walked out. His solicitor followed, nearly at a run. Vivienne looked at the note on the table. Forsyth, after a moment, slid it toward her. It was from Crane. Materials recovered by constables this morning from Reston's lodgings. Full chemical analysis confirmed. Warrant issued 1 hour ago. Gerald Ravenshire named. I was not compromised. I was being followed. I apologize for the delay. Crane. She read it once. She handed it to Nathaniel. He read it and set it down and sat for a moment with his hands flat on the table. Not still, exactly, the way they had been still in the carriage on their wedding day, the trained stillness of a man managing what his body wanted to do. This was different. This was the stillness of a man who has been running for 14 months and has just been told he can stop, and whose body doesn't yet know how to receive that information. She put her hand over his on the table. Not a gesture, not performed. Just the physical fact of one person's hand on another person's, in a room where a great deal had just changed, and both of them needed a moment to stand in that change before moving through it. Outside in the corridor, raised voices. Gerald's solicitor. Another voice she didn't recognize. The sound of the building's front door opening and closing with a force that was not quite a slam, but was close. Forsyth looked at the room, at the banking creditors, at Callum, still standing against the wall, at the Duke and Duchess of Ravenshire, sitting at the head of the table their family had built. I'll need, Forsyth said carefully, to formally request the warrant documentation before any of this is processed through the estate. Of course, Nathaniel said. His voice had something in it she had not heard in it before. Something that was not the management of exhaustion or the compression of pain or the measured delivery of a man conserving his resources for the next threat. Something that was simply present. His voice arriving in the room without reservation, without the specific quality of a person carrying a weight they weren't allowed to set down. The quarterly review did not resume that day. What resumed, in the offices on Cornhill Street, in the presence of Forsyth and the banking creditors, and a Callum who finally sat down in his chair against the wall, was something else entirely. The long and detailed and thoroughly documented business of dismantling what Gerald Ravenshire had built. It would take time. These things always took time. The law moved at the speed of institutional gravity, and institutional gravity was not fast. But it moved. And in the corridor outside, Agnes was still sitting with the housekeeper when Vivienne came out. Agnes stood up, her face holding the careful readiness of someone who had prepared herself for the worst and had not yet been told it wasn't required. It's done, Vivienne said. Agnes looked at her. You won't need to testify today. Vivienne paused. But I want you to know that you would have. I want you to know that we would have walked in there with nothing but your account, and it would have been enough. She held the young woman's gaze. What you did mattered. It will be documented that it mattered. Agnes blinked, nodded, said nothing, because there was nothing to say that was larger than what had just been said. Vivienne went back into the boardroom. Nathaniel was still at the table. He was looking at the warrant documentation that Crane's messenger had delivered, reading it with the same attention he had applied to everything. Careful, complete, extracting the full structure of the thing rather than its surface. He looked up when she came in. She sat down across from him. The room was mostly cleared. Forsyth was in the corner with the creditors, speaking in the low, urgent tones of institutional men recalibrating. Henrietta, she said. The warrant names her. His voice was level. As co-conspirator. Gerald will try to bargain. Yes. He'll offer Reston. He'll offer Fenwick. He'll try to position himself as peripheral. He can try. Nathaniel looked at her. Crane says the evidence is sufficient to make that argument very difficult. She nodded. Outside the window, London continued. Carts, voices, the city's indifferent machinery. Somewhere in it, Gerald Ravenshire was in a carriage or on foot, moving toward a solicitor or a banker or a contact who would tell him whether there was still a version of this situation that could be managed. Somewhere in it, Henrietta Morrow was at home, or was not at home, and would learn what the morning had produced. Somewhere in it, a warrant was moving through the constabulary at the speed that warrants move, which was faster than it had been this morning. Vivienne sat in the boardroom of Aldgate and Sons and understood that the part of this that had required running was over. What came next would require a different thing: steadiness, patience, the willingness to sit in a process rather than sprint through one. She could do that. She had always been able to do that. It was the sprinting she had never expected to manage. Vivienne? She looked at Nathaniel. When this is settled, he said. He stopped. He looked at the table for a moment and then back at her, and his face had the quality it had carried at midnight in his bedroom at Alderley. The raw, unguarded version, the one that had not been assembled for any audience. I want to find the woman Fenwick assessed 3 years ago, the one the letter referenced. She looked at him. She doesn't know what was done to her, he said. She's somewhere operating on a verdict that was manufactured for someone else's purpose. The same verdict you operated on. His jaw was tight. I want to find her. Vivienne's hands were still on the table, outside London. Above them, somewhere, the warrant doing its work. We will, she said. Not a promise dressed as certainty. Just the plain statement of what was going to happen next. The same way she had been stating the next things for the past week. Clearly, completely, without ornament. Yes, he said. The room was quiet. The fire across the room had burned down to its red core. Forsyth was still talking to the creditors. Callum had left to find a carriage. And in the long, ordinary silence of a morning that had not ended the way Gerald Ravenshire had designed it to end, the Duke and Duchess of Ravenshire sat at the table of their own estate's quarterly review and began, in the slow, deliberate way of people who have survived something large, to consider what came next. The law moved slowly and then all at once. Gerald Ravenshire was taken into custody on a Tuesday, 11 days after the quarterly review, 4 days after Reston gave his full account to the constabulary in exchange for leniency, 2 days after Fenwick's practice was suspended pending investigation, and Fenwick himself was found at a coaching inn in Bristol, attempting to arrange passage to the continent with a trunk containing more cash than a physician's legitimate income would produce. The arresting constables came to Gerald's Belgravia house at 7 in the morning, which was the hour chosen to ensure he would be there and to ensure the neighbors would see. Henrietta Morrow was not arrested. She was questioned, twice, by men who came to her Mayfair house and sat in her drawing room and asked her questions with the precise, unhurried manner of people who already knew the answers and were simply recording the distance between those answers and whatever she chose to say. She was not arrested because Crane, reviewing the evidence with the clarity of a man who had been vindicated by circumstance and was determined to be useful in the aftermath, concluded that her letter to Hargreave, damning as it was, sat at the outer edge of direct criminal culpability. She had conspired. She had communicated intent. She had provided the social infrastructure through which Vivienne's ruin had been routed. But the law's specific architecture required a directness that Henrietta had been careful, across 60 years of careful living, never to provide. Vivienne received this information in Crane's office on a gray February morning and sat with it for a long time. She walks, she said finally. Crane looked at her across the desk. In the criminal sense, the estate's civil case against her is still viable, and her position in London society is changed. Permanently, Crane said. He paused. What she did to you, the Fenwick matter, will be part of the public record once Gerald's case is heard. Her name will appear in that record. People will read it. Vivienne looked at the window. The February London sky was the color it had been on the day she married. The same gray, the same flat light, the same city continuing its business beyond the glass with the indifference of a place that did not particularly track the outcomes of individual lives. She thought about what she had expected to feel at this moment. She had, in the months of building toward it, imagined something larger, a clean, complete settling, the specific satisfaction of a verdict delivered. What she felt instead was more complicated and less dramatic. The particular exhaustion of a fight that had taken everything she had, and underneath it, quieter. The first faint stirring of something that was not relief exactly, but was adjacent to it. The sense of weight that has been present long enough to feel structural, beginning, incrementally, to lift. It's enough, she said. Crane looked at her. Not because it's all she deserves, Vivienne said, but because spending the rest of my life measuring what she deserves is not something I'm willing to do. She looked at him directly. I want her name in that record. I want every detail documented, and then I want to be finished with her. Crane nodded. He understood the distinction, just not between justice and mercy, but between the justice that serves the person seeking it and the justice that begins to consume them. He had been a solicitor for 35 years and had watched people choose both directions, and he had a clear preference for which one produced lives worth living afterward. Then we're nearly finished, he said. Dear Nathaniel received his proper medical treatment in the 3rd week of February. The physician was a man named Dr. Hartwell, brought from Edinburgh on the recommendation of a colleague who had no connection to any party in the preceding events. A careful, precise man in his 50s who had published research on exactly the compound Pembroke had described, and who arrived at Ravenshire House in Grosvenor Square, read the chemist's analysis, and spent 40 minutes examining Nathaniel with the focused attention of someone encountering a clinical situation that was, to his professional mind, deeply interesting, and to his human one, deeply infuriating. Vivienne sat outside the examination room. She had not been asked to leave. She had chosen to give Nathaniel that hour without an observer, not because she doubted what Hartwell would find, but because there is a specific privacy required for the moment when a person discovers the full extent of what has been done to their own body, and that privacy was something she could give him. She sat in the corridor of their London house and listened to the city outside and thought about the woman she had been in October, stepping out of a carriage in front of this building for the first time with everything she owned and nothing she had chosen, moving toward a marriage that London had already pronounced a burial. She had been so tired that day. Not physically, the specific bone-deep exhaustion of someone who has been managing their own survival at close quarters for long enough that the management itself has become the primary occupation of their life. The exhaustion of being careful, of performing, of walking through rooms where every person present had already received and processed and filed a verdict about who she was and what she was worth. She had not understood yet that the exhaustion itself was a form of evidence not of weakness, but of duration, of a person who had been carrying something unreasonable for an unreasonable amount of time and had not set it down. The door opened. Nathaniel came out alone. Hartwell remained inside, writing his documentation with the thorough efficiency of a man who understood that in this particular case, the paperwork was the point. Nathaniel sat down beside her in the corridor. He sat the way he had sat in his bedroom at Alderley on the night they had found the letter, with the stillness of a man processing something large in the specific privacy of his own body before it became language. She waited. Hartwell says 3 months, Nathaniel said, of treatment. Proper treatment, the compound addressed correctly. He says the damage is... He says it's not permanent. He paused. He says most of it isn't permanent. She registered the distinction in most. She sat with it the way she had learned over the preceding months to sit with the parts of things that were painful without turning away from them. What part is? She said. The episodes in the early months. There are some things that may take longer. His voice was even, and she could hear what the evenness cost. My hands. Some days. Hartwell says it's manageable. He looked at his hands on his knees, the same hand she had watched hold still in the carriage on their wedding day. I won't be what I was before October of last year. No, she said. I don't... He stopped, started again. I don't know what that means yet. For the estate. For what I'm capable of managing. You'll manage it differently than you did before, she said. That isn't the same as not managing it. He looked at her. The corridor was quiet and the house around them was doing its ordinary business. The sounds of a household in operation, fires being laid, the below-stairs life continuing its rotation. And in the middle of all that ordinary continuity, Nathaniel Ravenshire was sitting in a corridor with the face of a man who had spent 14 months being slowly unmade and was now, for the first time, being offered the materials to make himself into something else. I don't know how to do this part, he said. The honesty of it was total and unguarded. The admission of a man who had managed every part of the preceding crisis with the compressed efficiency of someone running on discipline and had now reached the part that discipline alone couldn't navigate. Fighting I can do. Building the case, managing the room, making decisions under pressure. I know how to do those things. He paused. I don't know how to sit in a house that's safe and simply be in it. She understood what he meant. She had been understanding it for weeks, watching it in both of them. The specific difficulty of people who have organized their entire operational capacity around a crisis, who have been running towards something for so long that the cessation of running produces not rest, but a vertiginous unfamiliarity. The body that has been a weapon doesn't know how to be ordinary. Neither do I, she said. He looked at her. I've been performing a version of myself that was built to survive a specific situation, she said. I don't know yet what I am when the situation is over. She held his gaze. I think we find out. I don't think there's a faster way to do it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you could have left after the quarterly review. When the warrant was issued and the case was in Crane's hands, you had enough. Your name was going to be cleared regardless of whether you stayed. She looked at him steadily. I know, she said. Why didn't you? She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Not the social answer, not the answer that framed the decision in the language of duty or obligation, but the actual answer, the one that had been forming in her for months the way things form that are real, gradually and without announcement. Because I stopped wanting to leave, she said. Simply. The way she had learned over the preceding months to say accurate things without dressing them. Nathaniel looked at her for a long time. He reached over and put his hand over hers on the bench between them. Not a gesture, not performed. The same quality as when she had put her hand over his at the quarterly review table. The physical fact of one person choosing proximity to another, in a corridor where a great deal had been lost and a great deal had been recovered, and both of them were sitting in the strange new country of what came next. All right, he said. Check. They went back to Alderley in March. The London house was retained. There was business that would require London for months yet. The legal proceedings against Gerald moving through the courts with the institutional gravity Crane had described, requiring periodic attendance and documentation, and the specific patience of people waiting for a system to complete a process they had initiated. But London was not where they needed to be, and both of them understood this without a lengthy discussion. The Shropshire countryside received them in early spring, not the dramatic spring of literature, all sudden blooms and transformed light, but the real English spring, which arrives incrementally and with considerable ambiguity, the cold not fully releasing, the green coming in by degrees, the landscape making its decision in the slow way that landscapes make decisions that actually hold. Mrs. Hartley met them at the door with the same compressed authority she had deployed in October and the same quality underneath it. Not sentiment, but something that had chosen to express itself as efficiency. She looked at Nathaniel, at the specific way he moved up the front steps, and whatever she assessed she kept internally, which was the mark of a woman who understood that observation in service of care was not the same as commentary. She looked at Vivienne. I've had the East Wing sitting room reorganized, she said. I thought you might want the desk moved toward the garden window. I do, Vivienne said. Mrs. Hartley nodded and went inside to communicate this to someone, and the transaction was complete. The small acknowledgement that the Duchess of Ravenshire's preferences were known and considered and factored into the house's operation, that there was a person here whose understanding of what Vivienne needed was already being incorporated into the daily life of the place. It was the smallest possible thing. It undid her briefly in the entryway, with her back to the courtyard and the cold spring air still on her coat, because there is a specific quality to being known by a place, to a house having learned your preferences, to a room being arranged around what you actually require rather than what is expected of you, that reaches past the practical and into something older and less articulable. She had not had this before. Not in the Ashcroft house, where every arrangement had been made around her mother's preferences, and her own had been a secondary consideration at best. Not in the year of her ruin, when she had been too occupied with managing the damage to consider what she might actually want in a room. She stood in the entryway of Alderley and breathed, once, deliberately, and then went inside. See, the woman they found was named Catherine Alderton. Crane's investigator located her in April in a village in Wiltshire, the unnamed woman from Henrietta's letter, the earlier instance of Fenwick's practiced fabrication. She was 29, unmarried, living in circumstances that bore the specific marks of a life that had been comprehensively altered by a single false verdict delivered 3 years prior. She had been engaged. The engagement had not survived Fenwick's assessment. The circumstances of its termination had not been kept private. Vivienne went to Wiltshire without announcing it in advance. Not with Crane, not with Callum, with Nathaniel, because she had decided early that this was not a legal errand but a human one. And the thing Catherine Alderton most needed was not an official account of what had been done, but the specific knowledge that another person had stood in the same place and was, presently, standing somewhere else. Catherine received them in a small sitting room with the careful composure of a woman who had learned to manage the presentation of a life that had not gone as intended. She was fair-haired, direct-eyed, with a quality in her face that Vivienne recognized. Not defeat, but the specific texture of someone who has been carrying an understanding they couldn't prove for long enough that it had become part of their daily weight. Vivienne sat across from her and told her directly what Fenwick had done and why and what the evidence showed. She did not soften it. She did not construct it as a story with redemptive framing or a moral about perseverance. She laid it plain, the facts, the documentation, the name of the man who had paid for the fabrication, and the present status of that man's circumstances. Catherine listened without expression until Vivienne finished. Then she said, "I knew." Vivienne looked at her. "I always knew it wasn't true," Catherine said. Her voice was very steady. "But knowing a thing isn't true and being able to prove it are not the same thing. And for 3 years I've been the woman who—" She stopped. "People don't look at you the same way once a verdict like that has circulated, even the people who believe you knew." "No," Vivienne said. "They don't." Catherine looked at her. "How did you—" She stopped again, reassembled. "How do you stop being that person, the one the verdict was about?" Vivienne was quiet for a moment. She thought about the answer with the same attention she gave to things that required accuracy rather than reassurance. She thought about the October morning when she had walked into her mother's parlor and found Nathaniel Ravenshire already seated, looking at her with the direct attention of a man who had decided information was more useful than performance. She thought about the corridor at Alderley and the documents on the desk, and the night they had sat together in lamplight building the shape of a case out of the materials that people who wanted them gone had thought they'd buried. She thought about the woman she had been in that carriage on the wedding day. Exhausted, precise, with the specific clarity of someone who has had everything taken and is therefore carrying nothing extra. "You don't stop being her," Vivienne said finally. "She's part of the structure now. What she went through, what it cost, the specific kind of attention it required. That doesn't leave." She held Catherine's eyes. "But she stops being the only version of you that's available. Other versions become possible. And after a while, the other versions are the ones people see first." Catherine looked at her for a long time. Then she said quietly, "That's useful." "I know," Vivienne said. "Someone should have said it to me earlier." Chetsum. Gerald Ravenshire's trial concluded in June. The verdict was delivered on a Thursday, in a courtroom that had filled by 8 in the morning with the specific quality of crowd that assembles for the sentencing of a person who has been powerful. Not the crowd that comes for sensation, but the one that comes to witness the accounting. The people for whom this outcome represents something about the relationship between power and consequence that they needed to see adjudicated in public. Gerald was convicted on 4 counts. The sentence was substantial. His title was not stripped by the trial. That required a separate parliamentary process that Crane had already initiated. But his access to it was functionally ended, his financial assets seized pending the estate's civil recovery case. His social standing collapsed overnight in the specific total way that certain kinds of public exposure collapse things that have been carefully constructed over decades. The structure falls, and the rubble doesn't leave room for the original version to be reassembled. Henrietta Morrow's name was read into the record 4 times during the proceedings. Each time, the courtroom's quality of silence changed. She did not attend. Vivienne attended every day. Not from vindication. Vindication was too simple a word for what she felt in that courtroom, and too small. She attended because she had decided early that the things done in her name required her witness, that looking away from the accounting because the accounting was uncomfortable was a luxury she was not willing to purchase at the cost of the full truth. Nathaniel sat beside her on each of those days. On the final day, when the verdict was delivered and the room produced its specific sound, not celebration, not exactly, but the collective exhale of people who have been waiting for a fact to be confirmed, she felt his hand find hers under the edge of the bench. She held it. They stayed until the room had cleared. They sat in the emptying courtroom while the barristers gathered their materials and the observers filed out, and the formal apparatus of the proceeding was dismantled around them, and they sat in the quiet that remained in the way that people sit in a place where something significant has just happened, not ready yet to step fully into what comes after. "It's over," he said. She thought about this, tested it against what was actually true. "The part that was a fight is over," she said. "The rest of it is just—" She paused. "Life, which is longer." He looked at her with the face she knew now in all its versions. The managed version, the exhausted version, the version at midnight with an iron poker, the version across a boardroom table, and this one, the one that existed when all the versions that had been necessary were no longer required, and what remained was simply his face, present, looking at her. "I'm glad it was you," he said. She understood the full weight of it, not the gratitude for what she had done in the months of the fight, though that was in it, but something prior and more complete. The gladness at the specific person who had descended the stairs in a gray dress on a Thursday morning in October and looked at him with the direct attention of someone who had decided that accurate maps were more useful than pretty ones. "So am I," she said. Alderley in summer was a different house than Alderley in winter. The kitchen garden that had held its bare geometry in November came into its full complicated life in July. The organized abundance of a productive garden, the specific smell of warm earth and growing things that is one of the oldest smells available to human beings, and that carries, underneath its pleasantness, the plain fact of continuation, of things that were dormant and are now moving. Vivienne stood at the sitting room window on a July morning and watched Nathaniel walk through the kitchen garden below with the slower pace that Hartwell had described, not diminished, not limited in any way that changed the fundamental quality of his presence, but different from the compressed efficiency of the man who had moved through his own house at midnight 3 seasons ago. He moved like a man who had put down something he had been carrying for a long time and was recalibrating to his own weight without it. He stopped at the end of the garden path and looked up at her window. She lifted a hand. He lifted his. The gesture was simple and ordinary and contained in its simplicity everything that the preceding 8 months had moved toward, not the dramatic resolution, not the moment of confrontation, or the courtroom verdict, or the specific satisfaction of a conspiracy dismantled, but this. 2 people on opposite sides of a window, both still standing, both present, exchanging the uncomplicated signal of ordinary life continuing. She had been many things in the months between October and now. She had been precise and frightened and resolute and exhausted, and more than once had stood in a room with the specific quality of someone who understood that they had no options left except the most dangerous one, and had chosen it anyway. She had been the woman the drawing rooms had written off, and the woman who had walked back into those drawing rooms with evidence in her hands, and the specific posture of someone who no longer required those rooms' verdict to understand her own value. She had learned something in those months that she was still learning the dimensions of, that the version of yourself built under pressure, the one assembled in the dark, from the materials of necessity, in the company of someone who was doing the same, that version does not disappear when the pressure lifts. It becomes the foundation. Everything built on top of it has the specific solidity of something resting on ground that has been tested. She was the Duchess of Ravenshire. She had been made so by a transaction designed to dispose of her quietly, and she had turned the disposal into something that the people who designed it could not have anticipated because they had only ever looked at her from the outside and therefore only ever seen the surface of what was available to be used. They had not seen what was underneath. Nobody who looked at a person from the outside ever saw that. Nathaniel came back in through the kitchen door. She heard his footsteps on the stairs. The particular sound of them, familiar now, the way the sounds of a specific person in a specific house become the house's own language over time. He knocked on the connecting door. "Come in," she said. He came in with the morning paper and 2 cups of coffee that someone had given him in the kitchen, and the unhurried quality of a man who had, finally, and with considerable difficulty, arrived at a version of his own life that he did not have to spend all his energy defending. He set 1 cup on the desk beside her and sat in the other chair with the paper and did not immediately open it, just sat with his coffee in the summer morning light of a room that had been arranged around what she needed and that she had, over the months, made her own in the small ways that turned spaces into places. The books arranged by her own system, the desk worn slightly at the edge from her particular way of resting her wrist against it, the view of the kitchen garden that she had looked at in every season now and in which she could track, by the garden's own evidence, the passage of time from the woman she had been when she first looked at it to the woman looking at it now. "Catherine wrote," Vivienne said. "She is reconsidering her situation in Wiltshire." "Good," Nathaniel said. "She has a cousin in Bath who has been asking her to come." "Will she?" "I think she might." Vivienne looked at the letter on the desk. "I think she is beginning to believe that other versions are possible." Nathaniel looked at her over the edge of his coffee cup. "You told her that," he said. "Yes." "Was it true when you said it?" She considered this with the honesty that she had learned over months of requiring it in every other direction to apply also to herself. "I was beginning to believe it when I said it," she said. "I believe it more now." He nodded. Outside, the summer garden was doing its patient, unhurried work. The house held them in its accumulated quiet, the quiet of walls that had stood through difficulty and were still standing, that had learned the specific grammar of the people living inside them, and were, in the way of old houses, recording it. Nathaniel opened the paper. Vivienne turned back to the window. The morning light came in and settled across the desk and the books and the floor between them, the particular light of a July morning in Shropshire that had no agenda and required nothing and simply was, generous and indifferent and completely sufficient. She put her hand around the coffee cup. It was warm. She drank it.